Somewhere beneath the sand of the Arabian desert, there's a city. Not a ruin you can visit with a tour guide. Not something in a museum with a little plaque explaining what it used to be. A city so old, so completely swallowed by the earth, that for most of human history, people thought it was just a story, a myth, a warning whispered around campfires. But it wasn't a myth. It was real, and it might be older than Egypt, older than the pyramids, older than almost anything we consider ancient. Think about that for a second. When we talk about ancient civilizations, we usually mean Egypt, right? The pyramids, the pharaohs, 5,000 years of history stretching back into the mists of time. That's ancient to us. That's about as old as human memory goes. But this city, this lost city buried under the sands of the empty quarter, may have existed before any of that. Before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was ever laid. Before writing. Before most of what we consider the birth of civilization. And then it vanished. Completely, not slowly abandoned like so many ancient cities. Not conquered and rebuilt into something else. Gone. Swallowed, erased so thoroughly that for thousands of years nobody could even agree it had existed at all. Some called it a legend, some called it a lie. The Arabian version of Atlantis, a cautionary tale dressed up as history. Here's the question that should be keeping you up right now. How does an entire city, one wealthy enough, powerful enough to be mentioned in the Quran, in Roman texts, in the memories of desert tribes for thousands of years, just disappear? How do you lose a whole civilization? Not metaphorically lose it, but literally lose it under the earth so completely that modern satellites had to find it from space. That's where we're going today. Into the sand, into the myth, into one of the strangest archaeological mysteries of the 20th century. One that involves ancient prophets, cursed cities, secret trade routes soaked in gold and incense, and a sinkhole that may have swallowed an entire civilization whole. But before we go further into the desert, I want to know where you're listening from. Seriously, drop it in the comments right now. Tell me your city, your country, and what time it is for you right this second. I read these, and it's honestly one of my favourite parts of doing this. Sometimes it's someone in Sydney getting ready for their morning coffee. Sometimes it's someone in Toronto trying to fall asleep at midnight. Sometimes it's 3 a.m. somewhere I've never even heard of. There's something kind of beautiful about that. All of us, scattered across different time zones, different corners of the planet, ending up in the exact same place, listening to the same story about a city that vanished into the sand thousands of years ago. It connects us in this weird, quiet way. So go ahead, tell me where you are and what time it is right now. And if you want to keep finding stories like this one, stories that take something ancient and half forgotten and drag it back into the light, the best way to support what I'm doing here is by following the show on Spotify. It's free. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps keep this channel going. The link's right there in the description. Now, back to the desert. Because what we're about to explore isn't just legend anymore. This isn't campfire folklore or wishful thinking. This is a real physical location that scientists, archaeologists, and even NASA have spent decades trying to find, trying to prove, trying to understand. Somewhere under those endless dunes lies the evidence of a civilization that thrived long before Egypt, long before recorded history as we know it, and then collapsed into the earth so completely that we almost lost it forever. We're about to dig it back up. Long before anyone wrote a single word about this place, people were already talking about it. Not writing, talking, sitting around fires in the deep desert night, wrapped against the cold that comes when the sun disappears, and the sand that baked you alive at noon suddenly turns brutal in the other direction. And in that darkness, with nothing but stars and silence stretching in every direction, someone would start telling the story. The story of a city that used to be there, right there, somewhere past the dunes, somewhere the wind never quite lets you find. A city so rich it seemed to mock the heavens themselves. And a city that paid for that arrogance with total annihilation. This is where every real mystery starts, isn't it? Not with an archaeologist and a shovel, but with a voice in the dark, passing something down because it was too important, too terrifying, too astonishing to let die. For the nomadic peoples of the Arabian Peninsula, the Bedouin tribes who have crossed that desert for thousands upon thousands of years, this story wasn't entertainment. It was memory. It was warning. It was, in some strange way, an inheritance, handed from grandparent to grandchild, the same way you might hand down a name or a blood type. You didn't question whether the city existed any more than you'd question whether your own grandfather existed. It was simply true the way the desert itself was true. Vast, undeniable, older than anyone could remember. Now, picture the geography here for a second, because it matters. We're talking about the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, one of the largest continuous sand deserts on the entire planet. This isn't a stretch of sand you walk across in an afternoon. This is an ocean of dunes covering roughly 250,000 square miles, dunes that can rise over 800 feet high, shifting and reshaping themselves constantly, swallowing whatever the wind decides to swallow. It's one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Summer temperatures that can climb past 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Almost no permanent water sources. A landscape so unforgiving that even today, with satellites and GPS and air-conditioned vehicles, people still get lost out there and never come back. Now imagine trying to hide an entire city in that. That's the contrast that makes this legend so hard to shake off. On one hand, you have this idea of a magnificent civilization, wealthy beyond imagination, built on soaring pillars, glittering with wealth pulled from trade routes that stretched across continents. On the other hand, you have quite possibly the least hospitable, most punishing environment human beings have ever tried to survive in. It's almost poetic in a dark kind of way. A city built on excess, swallowed by nothing. A monument to human ambition, erased by something as simple as patient, as endless as sand. And that contrast is exactly why the story stuck around for so long. Think about what oral tradition actually requires to survive for centuries, sometimes thousands of years, without a single written word. It requires emotional weight. Facts alone don't survive that kind of journey. Facts get distorted, forgotten, mixed up with 100 other facts along the way. But emotion that survives, fear survives, awe survives. The story of a city punished for its pride, wiped from existence as if the earth itself had grown tired of its arrogance. That's not just a historical footnote. That's a lesson. That's a warning parents told their children before letting them wander too far from camp. Don't get too proud. Don't forget where you came from. Remember what happened to the city of the pillars, for the desert peoples living in and around this landscape. That story wasn't abstract. It was practical. It explained why certain regions were avoided. It explained strange features in the sand, odd depressions, patterns that didn't quite make sense. It gave meaning to a place that otherwise offered nothing but heat and silence and death. Humans do this everywhere, in every culture, on every continent. We take the unexplainable and we wrap a story around it, because a story we can understand, even a frightening one, is better than an emptiness we can't. But here's what makes this particular legend different from countless other desert myths that got swallowed by time and forgotten completely. This one didn't fade. If anything, it got stronger. It found its way into written record after written record across completely different cultures, different languages, different eras of history, all somehow describing the same basic outline. A magnificent city, immense wealth, pillars rising from the sand like something built by giants, and then catastrophic destruction, as though something or someone had decided this civilization had grown too proud to be allowed to continue existing. That kind of consistency doesn't usually happen with pure fiction. Pure fiction drifts. It changes shape depending on who's telling it, what they want to emphasize, what audience they're trying to entertain. But when you get the same basic structure showing up again and again across centuries and civilizations that had no direct contact with each other, that starts to look less like folklore and more like distorted memory. Like something that actually happened passed down through so many generations that the specific details blurred, but the core truth never quite disappeared, so the question becomes unavoidable. Was this actually just a moral fable? A story invented to teach humility to desert wanderers? Or were people describing something they, or their distant ancestors, had actually witnessed? A real place, a real disaster, something so catastrophic it left a permanent scar on the collective memory of an entire region. Because here's the thing about legends that persist this long, this consistently, across this many independent sources. Eventually, someone starts asking whether there's a kernel of literal truth buried underneath all that folklore. Eventually, someone stops treating it as a bedtime story and starts treating it as a lead, a clue, a place to start digging, literally and figuratively. And that's exactly what started to happen, because this story wasn't confined only to campfires and oral tradition passed between nomadic families. It made its way into something far more permanent, something that would eventually catch the attention of scholars, historians, and eventually explorers willing to risk their lives searching for a city most people insisted was nothing more than myth. It made its way into scripture, because somewhere along the way this legend of a magnificent doomed city stopped being just campfire folklore whispered among desert tribes. It got written down. Not in some obscure regional text destined to be forgotten, but in one of the most widely read and deeply studied religious texts in human history. And that changes everything, because once a story like this gets enshrined in scripture, it stops being dismissible. It demands to be examined seriously, studied, questioned, and ultimately searched for. So that's exactly where we're headed next, into the words of the Quran itself, where this city gets a name, a fate, and a warning meant to echo through the ages. Iram of the Pillars. So we arrive at the Quran, and specifically we arrive at a passage that has frustrated, fascinated, and driven scholars and explorers for over 1,000 years. Surah 89, Al-Fajr, the Dawn. In the midst of describing divine justice and the fate of those who defied their creator, the text drops a name that sounds almost mythological in its sheer weight and grandeur. Iram al-Imad, Iram of the Pillars, or sometimes translated as Iram of the Tent Poles, Iram of the Columns. The phrasing is deliberate, and it's striking, because the Quran doesn't just say Iram. It adds that specific descriptor, the pillars. Why? In Arabic literary tradition, adding such a descriptor to a city's name serves one primary purpose. It's telling you that this place was defined by its architectural audacity. These pillars weren't just structural supports holding up some roof. They were monuments. They were declarations of power, of wealth, of human capability pushed to its absolute limits. The text is painting a picture of a city that looked unlike anything else on earth. A place where the buildings reached upward with such ambition that the pillars themselves became the city's identity, its signature, the way you'd recognize it from miles away across the flat desert horizon. And the descriptions of grandeur don't stop with the pillars. Later Islamic traditions, drawing on both the Quranic reference and older oral histories, expanded on what Iram actually looked like when it stood in its prime. Imagine walking toward this city from the desert, heat shimmering off the sand, and suddenly seeing something impossible rising ahead of you. Not just a cluster of mud brick buildings huddled together for shade, which was how most desert settlements looked, but a city built on a scale that seemed to belong to another world entirely. According to these traditions, Iram was constructed with stones so massive that later generations insisted they must have been placed by supernatural beings, by jinn, by forces beyond normal human strength. The streets were paved, not with packed earth, but with actual cut stone, something almost unheard of in the ancient Arabian context. The walls of its buildings were described as gleaming, possibly covered in polished stone or even metals that caught the desert sun and made the entire city shine, like a mirage that had somehow decided to become solid and real. And everywhere, those pillars, thick as ancient trees, taller than anything a nomad passing through would have ever seen in their entire life, marching in rows along avenues, framing massive doorways, holding up roofs that covered spaces vast enough to hold hundreds of people gathered for trade, for worship, for the display of wealth that this city had accumulated from its position at the crossroads of the ancient world. But here's the crucial part, and this is where the story shifts from mere description to something far more significant. The Quran doesn't mention Iram simply to marvel at its architecture. It mentions Iram as a divine warning, as a cautionary tale etched into scripture itself. The passage in Surah 89 follows a pattern that appears repeatedly in the Quran, listing ancient civilizations that grew powerful, grew arrogant, and then were annihilated by a force they couldn't comprehend or resist. The text explicitly states that Iram was a city that had never seen its like created in the lands. That specific phrasing is important. It's not saying Iram was merely wealthy. It's saying Iram was unprecedented, a city that broke every rule of what human civilization was supposed to look like in that region. And then because of that unprecedented power, that unprecedented wealth, the people of Iram grew unprecedented in their arrogance. They believed their civilization was untouchable. They believed their walls and their pillars and their armies made them exempt from the laws that governed lesser societies. And the Quran's response to that belief is swift and absolute. Your pillars didn't save you, your wealth didn't protect you. Your unprecedented power was exactly what made your destruction necessary. The city that thought it had transcended every limitation was erased as if it had never existed at all. This framing transforms Iram from a historical curiosity into something far more potent. A moral instrument, a permanently installed reminder that no civilization, regardless of how powerful, how wealthy, how architecturally magnificent, stands above the fundamental laws of the universe. The Quran uses Iram the same way it uses the stories of the people of Ad, the people of Thamud, the people of Noah, not as anthropology, but as theology, as proof that hubris has consequences, that the desert, the divine, the forces that actually govern this world will not tolerate human arrogance indefinitely, and that when the reckoning comes, it comes completely. No trace left, no ruins to visit, no descendants to carry on the name. Just emptiness and silence and sand, and a warning preserved in text so that future generations might read it and understand. But Scripture didn't just preserve the warning, it preserved the memory. And that's where this gets really interesting, because once Iram entered the Quranic canon, it couldn't be forgotten. It couldn't drift the way purely oral traditions drift. It was locked in place, word by word, preserved across centuries with a fidelity that oral storytelling simply cannot maintain on its own. Every generation of Muslims who read Surah 89 encountered that name, Iram of the Pillars. And for every generation, that name posed an implicit challenge. What was this place? Where was it? Did it actually exist in physical reality? Or was it purely symbolic, a literary invention designed solely to carry a moral lesson? This question echoed far beyond Quranic scholarship. The memory of Iram seeped into later Arab folklore and took on new dimensions there, dimensions that only made the legend harder to dismiss as pure invention. In the oral traditions of the Bedouin and the written traditions of medieval Arab geographers, Iram transformed into something even more mythic. It became the archetypal lost paradise, the city of unimaginable delights buried beneath the dunes. Stories began to circulate about Iram's markets, where traders from every corner of the known world gathered to exchange goods worth more than entire kingdoms. About its gardens, somehow maintained in the heart of one of the most waterless regions on Earth, lush and green and fragrant, defying the desert that surrounded them. About its rulers, who walked through their pillar-lined halls wearing crowns and fabrics that common people couldn't even imagine. And about the fate that eventually claimed all of it. According to these folkloric expansions, the destruction wasn't just sudden, it was total and unnatural. Sand swallowed the city so completely that even the foundations disappeared. The dunes rolled over Iram like a tide over a footprint, erasing every trace of its existence until someone standing on that spot wouldn't even know a civilization had once thrived beneath their feet. These later folkloric descriptions might seem like embellishment, like the natural tendency of storytellers to add layers of fantasy onto a simpler original tale. But here's what's worth considering. Folklore often preserves details that the official texts leave out. The Quran gives us the framework. A powerful city, towering pillars, total destruction, a moral warning. The folklore fills in the texture, the markets, the gardens, the specific geography of the empty quarter, the manner of the erasure, sand swallowing everything. And some of those details, particularly the geographic ones, the insistence that this city existed in the deepest, most inaccessible part of the Arabian desert, align suspiciously well with what we now know about ancient trade networks and the environmental realities of that region. The folklore isn't just decorating a myth. It might be preserving actual memory of how a city in that specific location would have functioned, what it would have needed to survive, and ultimately, what would have destroyed it. So by the time we reach the medieval period, you have this multi-layered preservation system working to keep Iram alive in human consciousness. The Quran anchors the core narrative with unshakable authority. The folklore expands the narrative with details that might represent genuine historical memory distorted through centuries of retelling. And the moral framework ensures that people keep returning to the story, keep thinking about it, keep wondering whether that name, Iram of the Pillars, actually corresponds to a place you could find if you searched long enough and hard enough. Religious texts did something crucial for this legend. They took it out of the fragile world of oral tradition and placed it into the permanent world of written scripture. They gave it an authority that campfire stories alone could never possess. And they demanded that every future generation confront the same essential question that still drives the search today. Was this real? And if it was real, where is it now? So, where is it now? The folklore keeps pointing to the same answer, the same geographic reality, over and over again. The deepest, most inaccessible part of the Arabian desert. And when we talk about that specific place, we are not talking about some generic stretch of sand. We are talking about the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, and the name is not poetic exaggeration. It is a precise, clinical description of what you encounter when you step into this place. The Rub al-Khali is the largest sand desert on Earth. Over 500,000 square kilometers of it, stretching across portions of Oman, Yemen and the United Arab Emirates, with the vast majority sitting in southern Saudi Arabia. That is an area larger than France, covered almost entirely by sand. Not the flat, firm sand you might picture from movies, not the kind of terrain where you can just drive a vehicle across and hope to reach the other side. This is a labyrinth of dunes, some rising over 300 meters tall, taller than many skyscrapers, marching across the landscape in parallel ridges that shift and merge and reshape themselves with every major wind event. And the wind never really stops. The conditions here are not merely harsh. They are actively hostile to human life in ways that make most other extreme environments look forgiving. Summer temperatures routinely exceed 50 degrees Celsius. That is over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and that is the air temperature. The surface temperature of the sand can reach 70 degrees or more, hot enough to burn through the soles of standard footwear within minutes. The air is so dry that moisture evaporates from your body faster than you can process it, and a human unprepared for this environment can die of dehydration in less than a day. There is almost no surface water. There are almost no shade sources. There are almost no navigational landmarks once you are deep inside the dune fields, because the sand erases topography constantly. A ridge that existed yesterday might be gone tomorrow, replaced by a new formation that looks nothing like what any map, even a satellite image taken a week ago, would show you. This is not a place where things get lost. This is a place where things get consumed. And that consumption is exactly why a city could disappear here for millennia and stay hidden. The Rub al-Khali does not merely bury things, it absorbs them. Sand infiltrates every crack, every doorway, every room. It fills spaces from the bottom up, pressing against walls until they buckle, seeping through roofs until they collapse under the accumulated weight. And then the dunes keep growing above the ruins, adding layer after layer of sand on top of what was already buried, until the surface looks completely uniform, completely empty, completely devoid of any hint that something significant lies beneath. There is no protruding wall, there is no visible foundation. There is no landmark that says, something was built here. The desert smooths everything over. It takes the jagged remains of human ambition and grinds them down beneath millions of tons of silica until even the memory of a shape disappears from the surface. Historical attempts to cross this desert tell you everything you need to know about why discovery took so long. The Bedouin who lived on the edges of the empty quarter knew its boundaries intimately. They knew where the water sources were near its periphery. They knew which routes were marginally passable during certain seasons. But even they, the most skilled desert navigators on Earth, treated the deep interior as a zone to be avoided. Their oral traditions contain detailed warnings about entering the central regions, where the dunes became impassable even for camels, where there was no reliable water for hundreds of kilometers, where the heat and the terrain combined to create conditions that no amount of skill could overcome. And those warnings were not superstition. They were practical knowledge accumulated through centuries of experience, including the experience of people who tried to cross and never came back. Western explorers who later attempted to penetrate the Rub al-Khali fared even worse, and their failures are well documented. Bertram Thomas, who became one of the first Europeans to cross the empty quarter in 1930, succeeded only because he relied entirely on Bedouin guides who knew a specific route along the periphery, not through the central dune fields. Wilfred Thesiger, who made multiple crossings in the 1940s and wrote about them with vivid, haunting detail, described conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. He lost companions, he nearly died himself, and he traversed only certain sections, not the most inaccessible regions where the largest dunes concentrate. Other expeditions simply vanished. Parties that entered expecting to map the interior and emerged weeks later as survivors clinging to the edges, their equipment destroyed, their supplies exhausted, their confidence in European navigational technology permanently shattered by a landscape that refused to cooperate with any system designed to read it. This is why the search for Iram or for any lost city in this region took so long. You cannot explore terrain that kills the people trying to explore it. You cannot map a landscape that redesigns itself faster than your mapping tools can capture the data. You cannot spot ruins from the ground when those ruins are buried beneath dunes that tower above any vantage point you could reasonably reach. For centuries, the empty quarter guarded its secrets through pure, unyielding hostility. The desert did not need a curse to keep people away. It did not need supernatural protection or divine punishment. It had something far more effective. It had conditions that made human survival nearly impossible and observation of buried features completely impossible. The question was never whether something could be hidden in the Rub al-Khali. The question was whether any human could ever develop the capability to see through the sand, to reach beneath the surface without physically traversing the terrain that made surface access so lethal. And for a very long time, the answer to that question seemed to be no. The desert had won. The city stayed lost, but technology was about to change the rules entirely. But before technology could even attempt to look beneath those impossible dunes, you have to ask a much more fundamental question. Why would a city even exist out there in the first place? What could possibly compel people to build a permanent settlement in one of the most hostile environments on the planet? The Rub al-Khali does not offer fertile soil. It does not offer reliable water. It does not offer grazing land for livestock or natural resources that could sustain a population. Under normal circumstances, nobody builds a city in a place that is trying to kill you every single day. But the circumstances that led to the rise of Iram or Ubar, or whatever name you want to use for this lost settlement, were not normal. They were extraordinary, and they were driven by something that seems almost absurd from a modern perspective. Trees, specifically the resin from certain trees that grew in the southern Arabian highlands and the coastal regions bordering the empty quarter. Frankincense and myrrh. Now, if you are thinking that a city built on tree sap sounds ridiculous, you are not wrong. It sounds ridiculous, but you have to understand what frankincense and myrrh meant to the ancient world. These were not aromatic accessories. They were not the ancient equivalent of scented candles or essential oils. They were foundational components of religious, medical, and social life across multiple civilizations for thousands of years, and their value was astronomical. Frankincense, the dried resin harvested from boswellia trees, was the single most important material in religious practice throughout the ancient Near East, Egypt, and eventually the Mediterranean world. Every major temple, every significant ritual, every formal act of worship required incense. The Egyptians burned it in their temples to communicate with the gods, believing the rising smoke carried prayers directly into the divine realm. They also used it extensively in their elaborate mummification processes, packing frankincense into body cavities to slow decomposition and mask the inevitable odours of death. The Mesopotamian civilizations, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all incorporated incense into their temple rituals as offerings that were considered literally mandatory. You could not approach a deity without it. By the time the Roman Empire reached its peak, frankincense consumption had become staggering. Roman temples burned the resin in enormous quantities on a daily basis. Roman funerals required it, Roman public ceremonies demanded it, and Roman domestic life consumed it too, because wealthy citizens used incense to purify their homes, to mark important social occasions, and frankly, to demonstrate that they were rich enough to afford something that had to be imported from the other side of the known world. Myrrh, harvested from commiphora trees, served a parallel and equally essential role. It was used medicinally as an antiseptic and a wound treatment. It was used cosmetically in perfumes and skin preparations. It was used in embalming alongside frankincense, sometimes considered even more valuable because of its specific preservative properties. and it was burned as incense in contexts where frankincense was not appropriate, particularly in certain Egyptian and Mesopotamian rituals that required its distinct aromatic profile. The combined demand for these two resins created an economic engine that seems almost incomprehensible in its scale. We are talking about a market that stretched from the southern tip of Arabia to the banks of the Nile, from the Persian Gulf to the heart of Rome, spanning thousands of kilometers and connecting civilizations that had almost nothing in common except their desperate need for these specific substances. And the supply was entirely controlled by the people who lived where the trees grew. Southern Arabia, the regions bordering that impossibly hostile desert. This is where the incense roads come in. And I say roads plural because there was never just one route. The trade networks that carried frankincense and myrrh from their origins to their consumers operated on multiple paths, adapting to political changes, local conflicts, and environmental conditions over centuries. But the general structure was consistent. The resin was harvested in the Dhofar region of modern Oman and in the highlands of modern Yemen, areas that had just enough seasonal rainfall to support the boswellia and commiphora trees. From there it was transported by camel caravan northward and westward through or along the edges of the Arabian desert, following routes that had been established through generations of accumulated navigational knowledge. Knowledge that only the desert people possessed. The caravans moved along a network that eventually connected to 3 major destination zones. The western routes reached Egypt, travelling through territories that modern archaeology has traced along pathways skirting the Red Sea coast or cutting through the interior, depending on which local tribes controlled which segments at any given time. The northeastern routes reached Mesopotamia, passing through territories that linked southern Arabia to the great urban centres of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. And the northern routes, after passing through the Arabian interior, eventually reached ports on the Mediterranean coast, particularly Gaza, from which the incense could be shipped across the sea to reach every corner of the Roman world. The distances involved were immense. A single caravan travelling from southern Arabia to Gaza might cover over 3,000 kilometres. That is a journey of months requiring careful planning of water sources, feeding stops, and relationships with every tribal authority along the way who could either permit passage or attack the caravan and seize its cargo. And the cargo was worth fighting for. By the time frankincense reached Rome, its value had increased by orders of magnitude compared to what it cost at the point of harvest. Some historical estimates suggest that the price differential could be as much as 30 to 50 times the original cost. Every intermediary who handled the resin, every caravan leader who transported it across a dangerous stretch of desert, every tribal authority who extracted tolls or protection fees added to the final price. And the end consumers, whether they were Egyptian priests or Roman aristocrats, paid whatever was asked because they had no alternative source. The trees only grew in one region. The trade only flowed through one network. And the network only worked if the caravans could survive the desert. This is the economic context that makes a city in the empty quarter not just plausible but logical. Control of the incense trade meant control of one of the most lucrative commodity flows in the ancient world. And the key to controlling that flow was controlling the waypoints where caravans stopped, resupplied, paid tolls, and transferred their cargo between different segments of the route. A settlement positioned at a critical junction along these routes could extract wealth from every caravan that passed through it. Tolls, taxes, water fees, storage charges, protection payments. The specifics varied, but the principle was consistent. If you controlled the place where the trade had to stop, you controlled the money. And this is exactly what the legends describe Ubar as being. Not a city built on agriculture or manufacturing. Not a city sustained by local resources. A city that existed purely as a hub in the incense trade network. A waypoint, a nexus, a place where the flow of wealth between southern Arabia and the rest of the ancient world could be intercepted, taxed, and accumulated. The legends say Ubar grew rich from this position. Rich enough to build massive fortifications, rich enough to attract merchants from across the known world, rich enough to become legendary in its own time, a place whose name was spoken in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and maybe even Rome, not because of what it produced, but because of what it controlled. The passage of incense through the desert, the connection between supply and demand, the bridge between the trees that produced the resin and the civilizations that consumed it. The economic logic is sound. We have documented examples of other settlements along ancient trade routes that rose to prominence through exactly this mechanism. Palmyra in Syria, Petra in Jordan. Both became major urban centers, not because their local environments were exceptionally favorable, but because they occupied strategic positions along trade networks carrying valuable commodities across difficult terrain. The same principle could easily apply to a settlement positioned along the incense roads in southern Arabia. The empty quarter was the difficult terrain, the incense was the valuable commodity. And whoever controlled the waypoint in that terrain could theoretically accumulate enough wealth to build something that people would remember for thousands of years after it disappeared. So we have this economic engine, this trade network flowing across impossible terrain, making certain waypoints incredibly wealthy. And we have legends describing a city that exploited exactly this position. But legends alone don't prove anything. You can't build a historical case on oral traditions and religious texts alone. You need something harder. You need written records from people who were actually there, or at least people who were writing during the period when this city was supposedly thriving. And that's where things get both more interesting and more frustrating, because the written records do exist. They're real. You can read them yourself. But they don't exactly agree with each other, and they don't exactly agree with the legends, and separating what these ancient authors actually knew from what they merely heard from what they outright invented is a challenge that has driven scholars crazy for generations. Let's start with the heavyweight, Claudius Ptolemy, the guy who basically invented map-making as a systematic discipline. Writing in the 2nd century AD from Alexandria, that great melting pot of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman knowledge, Ptolemy produced his Geography, a work that attempted to map the entire known world with coordinates and regional descriptions. And in his mapping of the Arabian Peninsula, Ptolemy mentions something that has kept researchers arguing for over a century. He references a people he calls the Iobaritai. The spelling varies depending on which manuscript you're looking at and which scholar is doing the translating, but the core term is consistent enough to raise eyebrows. Iobarite, living in the region that corresponds roughly to the interior of southern Arabia, the area where the incense trade routes would have operated, the area where the empty quarter meets the more habitable highlands. Now here's where you have to be careful. Ptolemy does not say there is a great city called Ubar. He identifies a people, a tribe, or a population group associated with a specific region. But the name itself, Iobaritai, sounds suspiciously like it could be a Greek rendering of something related to Ubar or Iram. Linguistic transitions between languages in the ancient world were rarely clean. Greek authors regularly mangled foreign names, adapting them to Greek phonetic patterns, dropping sounds that didn't fit their alphabet, adding endings that made them conform to Greek grammatical conventions. The process was messy and inconsistent, so when you see Iobaritai, you can't definitively say this is definitely Ubar. But you also can't dismiss the possibility that it represents a Greek attempt to transliterate a local name that was related to what later Arabic sources would call Ubar. The linguistic connection is plausible but not proven, and that ambiguity is characteristic of basically everything about this topic. Ptolemy also provides coordinates for various settlements and waypoints in the region, and some of these have been scrutinized for potential matches to the legendary city's location. But ancient coordinate systems were imperfect. Ptolemy was working from second-hand reports, merchant accounts, travellers' tales, and earlier geographical works that may themselves have contained errors. His map of Arabia shows features that don't correspond neatly to modern geography, suggesting either that his sources were unreliable or that the landscape itself has changed over nearly 2 millennia of desert dynamics. So even if one of his marked settlements does correspond to Ubar's actual location, proving that correspondence requires assumptions about coordinate adjustments and landscape changes that are themselves debatable. You're building interpretation on top of interpretation on top of incomplete data. But Ptolemy wasn't alone. Other classical sources touch on the region in ways that contribute to the picture, however fragmentarily. Earlier Greek and Roman authors writing about Arabia frequently mention the wealth of the incense-producing regions and the mysterious interior settlements that controlled the trade. They don't always name specific cities, but they consistently describe a network of fortified waypoints in the desert, places where caravans stopped and where the flow of goods could be taxed and controlled. This general description matches what the legends say about Ubar's function, even if it doesn't provide the specific name. The picture gets more complicated when you bring in the later Arab historians and geographers. These writers, working in the medieval period, had access to local traditions and oral histories that the classical authors never possessed, and several of them explicitly mention Ubar, or something very close to it. The 10th century geographer Al-Hamdani, writing about the Arabian Peninsula, describes regions and settlements in southern Arabia with a level of local detail that suggests genuine familiarity. He references places that sound related to the Ubar tradition, though again the spelling and exact identification shift depending on the manuscript. Later writers like Yakut, compiling his massive geographical dictionary in the 13th century, include entries that clearly draw on the Ubar legend, describing a lost city in the desert that was destroyed as divine punishment for its inhabitants' arrogance. These accounts align with the Quranic narrative about Iram, but they add local details that aren't present in the religious text, specific geographic references, tribal affiliations, descriptions of the surrounding landscape. But here's the problem that keeps scholars arguing. The Arab sources don't agree with each other on key details. Some place Ubar in one location, others put it somewhere entirely different. Some describe it as a single city. Others seem to reference a region or a tribal territory rather than a specific settlement. Some say it was destroyed in ancient times. Others suggest it may have survived longer than the Quranic account implies. The inconsistencies aren't minor, they're fundamental. They affect where you would even look for the site and what you would expect to find if you found it. And this variation probably reflects something important about how the tradition developed. These writers weren't working from a single authoritative source. They were drawing from multiple oral traditions that had been evolving independently in different communities for centuries. Each community had its own version of the story, shaped by local geography, local tribal politics, local religious interpretations. When the medieval geographers compiled their works, they recorded whichever version they encountered, or sometimes multiple versions without clearly distinguishing between them, creating a textual record that looks consistent at first glance, but becomes increasingly contradictory when you examine it closely. This is the challenge of separating fact from embellishment. The classical texts give you fragments that might be related to Ubar, but might also be describing something entirely different. The Arab sources give you richer detail but with internal contradictions that undermine their reliability. And both categories of texts were written long after the period when Ubar, if it existed as a historical city, would have been active. Ptolemy was writing in the 2nd century AD. The Arab geographers were working centuries later still. None of them were contemporaries of the settlement they were describing. They were all working from inherited information, Whether that information came from merchant reports, oral traditions, or earlier texts that have since been lost, every layer of transmission introduced potential distortions. Names got changed, locations got shifted, events got dramatized or moralized. Practical details about trade and daily life got replaced with narrative conventions about divine punishment and legendary wealth. Yet despite all these problems, these texts served a crucial function. They kept the legend alive, without Ptolemy's reference, without the Arab geographers' entries, without the consistent thread of written mention stretching across centuries. The story of Ubar would have faded into the same obscurity that swallowed countless other settlements that rose and fell along ancient trade routes. The texts preserved the possibility. They created a paper trail, however tangled and unreliable, that later investigators could follow. They transformed what might have been just another forgotten desert waypoint into a persistent mystery, a question that refused to disappear because someone had written it down, however imperfectly. And that written record survived long after the city itself, if it existed, had vanished beneath the sand. But written records and tangled legends can only sustain a mystery for so long. Eventually, someone has to go look, and for centuries, nobody did. The empty quarter wasn't a place you just wandered into. It was a barrier, a void on the map that swallowed anyone who entered unprepared. The local tribes knew how to survive there, moving through its edges with their camels, tracking water sources that shifted seasonally, navigating by landmarks that existed only in their oral traditions. But for outsiders, for Europeans raised on those fragmentary ancient texts and desperate to prove them real, the Rub al-Khali was essentially a wall, a hot, deadly wall of sand that killed the curious and the unprepared alike. That wall held firm until 1930. That's when a British civil servant named Bertram Thomas decided he was going to cross it. Thomas wasn't an archaeologist. He wasn't a scholar hunting for lost cities. He was a political officer working in the Arabian desert, a man who had spent years learning local customs, picking up dialects, building relationships with tribal leaders. And somewhere along the way, he became obsessed with the empty quarter. Nobody from the West had ever crossed it. Nobody had ever traversed its full breadth and returned to tell the tale. Thomas wanted to be the first. He spent months preparing, gathering supplies, recruiting guides, negotiating safe passage through territories controlled by different tribal factions who might view a foreigner crossing their lands as an intrusion or a threat. This wasn't just logistics, this was diplomacy. Survival diplomacy, where a single misjudgment could leave you stranded in the desert without water or attacked by people who had no reason to trust your intentions. Thomas eventually assembled a caravan of camels and men, including local Bedouin who knew the desert's margins better than anyone alive, and then he set out into the sand. The crossing took weeks. Thomas and his party faced temperatures that could cook flesh, water shortages that forced them to drink from brackish wells that barely qualified as water sources, sandstorms that reduced visibility to nothing and filled every crevice of their bodies with grit. They pushed through terrain that shifted under their feet, dunes that reformed overnight, erasing any path they had established the day before. Every step was a negotiation with an environment that was actively trying to kill them. But Thomas made it. He emerged on the other side of the empty quarter, the first Westerner to accomplish the crossing. And along the way he noticed something that would electrify the search for Ubar. The Bedouin in his party, men who had lived in and around this desert their entire lives, told him stories. Not the kind of legends you find in medieval texts, but grounded, specific accounts of ruins they had seen or heard about from their fathers and grandfathers. They spoke of old wells in the desert, water sources that had been sealed up or buried by sand. They mentioned scattered remnants of buildings, fragments of walls, poking through the dunes in places nobody went anymore. and some of them used a name that sent chills down Thomas's spine. They called one such site Ubar. Thomas recorded these conversations carefully. He wasn't claiming he had found the lost city. He was reporting what local people told him, treating their knowledge as data rather than proof. But the implications were staggering. The Bedouin weren't reciting the Quranic story of Iram. They weren't quoting medieval geographers. They were describing physical features in the desert, ruins you could theoretically visit if you knew where to look and could survive the journey. Their traditions weren't literary. They were topographical. They were rooted in actual encounters with remnants of something old, something buried, something that might correspond to the legendary city the texts had been whispering about for over 1,000 years. A few years later, another explorer pushed even deeper. Wilfred Thesiger, a man who seemed almost constitutionally incapable of staying out of the world's most hostile environments, made multiple crossings of the empty quarter between 1945 and 1950. Thesiger wasn't looking for Ubar specifically. He was looking for something harder to define, a way of life that was disappearing, a connection to a landscape that most of the modern world considered uninhabitable. He travelled with the Bedouin not as their leader but as their companion, sharing their hardships, learning their skills, earning their respect through endurance and humility rather than authority. Thesiger documented the same pattern Thomas had noticed. The local tribes possessed detailed knowledge of the desert's hidden features, including sites they considered ancient and significant. They knew where certain ruins lay, roughly, because precise navigation in a landscape that constantly reshapes itself is almost impossible. They knew which wells had been used in times past, but were now buried or dry. They carried mental maps of the empty quarter's interior that were far more detailed than any Western cartographer had ever produced. Maps built from generations of experience rather than satellite imagery or coordinate systems. And Thesiger noticed something else. The Bedouins' attitude toward these ruins wasn't purely practical. They treated certain sites with a kind of wary respect, sometimes avoiding them, sometimes attributing them to peoples who had been destroyed by divine punishment. This wasn't just folklore colouring their geography. It seemed to reflect genuine encounters with places that felt wrong somehow. Places where the evidence of past habitation was so stark and so clearly terminated that it demanded an explanation beyond mere abandonment. The Bedouin had their explanation, the same one found in the Quranic narrative and the medieval geographers' accounts. These places had been destroyed because their inhabitants had transgressed. The fact that this explanation lined up with written traditions stretching back centuries didn't prove it was true, but it proved it was persistent. The story had survived in both texts and oral traditions, in libraries and in desert camps, maintaining its core shape across vastly different mediums and communities. Thomas and Thesiger's accounts did something crucial. They bridged the gap between the literary mystery and the physical landscape. Before their expeditions, Ubar existed primarily as a textual puzzle, a name in old books that might or might not correspond to anything real. After their reports, it became a place you could potentially walk to, a place with coordinates, however imprecise, anchored in the testimony of people who actually lived in and around the desert where it was supposed to lie. The search had moved from the library to the sand. This shift triggered a growing Western fascination that would only intensify over the following decades. Explorers, archaeologists, adventurers and dreamers all began circling the empty quarter, drawn by the possibility that one of history's most persistent legends might actually have a physical address. But the desert hadn't become any less deadly. The men and women who pursued this mystery faced the same dangers Thomas and Thesiger had confronted: extreme heat that could kill in hours, water sources that might or might not exist, where local knowledge suggested, tribal territories, where permission to travel had to be negotiated through relationships built over years. The empty quarter didn't care about your academic credentials or your passion for solving ancient mysteries. It was an equal opportunity killer, perfectly willing to bury anyone who underestimated it. And the search for Ubar was about to attract someone who understood that risk better than anyone who had tried before. Then the search for a lost city got something it had never had before. A vantage point from above the atmosphere. For centuries, anyone hunting for ruins in the Rub al-Khali faced the same fundamental problem. You were looking for something buried under millions of tons of sand, while standing on top of that same sand. Your field of vision was maybe a few hundred yards in any direction before the dunes swallowed the horizon. You could walk right over the remains of an ancient settlement and never know it, because the evidence was 10 feet below the surface and your eyes were 6 feet above it. The desert wasn't just hiding Ubar, it was compressing the search area into an impossibly small slice of a vast landscape, making the odds of stumbling onto the right spot almost comically low. Ground-based exploration, no matter how heroic or well-informed, was essentially blind. That changed when NASA got involved. Not because the space agency had a mandate to find lost Arabian cities, but because they had developed technology that could see things no human eye on the ground could detect. Satellite imaging had been evolving since the 1960s, originally designed for military reconnaissance and Earth resource mapping. But archaeologists began to realize that the same sensors trained on agricultural patterns and geological formations could also pick up traces of human activity that had been invisible for centuries. The principle was surprisingly simple, even if the technology behind it was anything but. Different materials reflect and absorb electromagnetic radiation in different ways. Stone, compacted earth, organic residues, even slight variations in soil moisture, they all leave spectral signatures that specialized cameras can capture from orbit. A buried wall doesn't just vanish, it alters the surface above it in subtle ways, changing how heat is absorbed during the day and released at night, modifying the vegetation that grows over it, sometimes creating barely perceptible depressions or ridges in the terrain above. From the ground, these variations are invisible from 300 miles up. With the right sensors, they start to talk. Radar imagery was even more revelatory. Unlike standard optical cameras that capture reflected light, radar systems bounce microwave pulses off the Earth's surface and measure what comes back. Because microwaves can penetrate certain materials, including dry sand to a limited depth, radar can sometimes detect structures that are completely hidden from visual inspection. The signal hits a buried wall or foundation, bounces back differently than it would from surrounding soil, and creates an anomaly in the data that analysts can interpret as something artificial beneath the surface. It's not X-ray vision. It doesn't give you a clean picture of what's underground, but it gives you something almost as valuable. It tells you where to look, and what those satellites found when they looked at the empty quarter wasn't just anomalies. They found roads, ancient caravan tracks, the routes that Frankincense traders had used for centuries to move their precious cargo from the producing regions of southern Arabia to the markets of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. On the ground, these tracks had been erased by wind and sand, obliterated by the same forces that had buried the city they connected. But from space, they reappeared, not as clear paved highways, but as faint traces, subtle linear patterns in the desert surface that had been worn into the terrain by thousands of years of camels and humans walking the same paths. The sand had covered them, but it hadn't erased the underlying impression completely. Like a footprint pressed into soft mud and then hidden by a thin layer of dust, the tracks were still there if you knew how to look for them. The satellites revealed something the Bedouin had never mentioned, something Thomas and Thesiger had never suspected. Multiple tracks converged from different directions, following routes that made sense for trade networks carrying goods across the peninsula. And they didn't just wander aimlessly through the desert. They focused, they converged on specific points, nodes in the ancient transportation system where caravans would stop, resupply, trade, rest. These convergence points were natural candidates for settlements, way stations, possibly even cities. The tracks were like fossilized circulatory system, and where the veins came together, you found the organs they had fed. This was the moment when modern technology and ancient legend collided in the most productive way possible. The Quranic story of Iram, the medieval geographers' accounts of Ubar, the Bedouins' oral traditions of a destroyed city, they had all pointed vaguely toward a region in the empty quarter. But vague wasn't good enough when you were dealing with a desert the size of France. The satellite data transformed vague into specific. It didn't prove that Ubar existed, but it identified places where something worth calling a city might have existed, places where the economic logic of the frankincense trade would have supported substantial settlements, places where the tracks converged and the spectral anomalies suggested buried structures. The excitement around this convergence was electric. For the first time, researchers weren't just hoping to find something. They were targeting something. They had coordinates. They had data suggesting artificial structures beneath the sand. They had a network of ancient roads pointing to locations that matched the historical descriptions of Ubar's general position. The search had moved from blind wandering to targeted investigation, from walking endlessly across deadly terrain, hoping for a miracle, to flying above it, reading the landscape like a map that had been hidden in plain sight for 1,000 years. But satellites could only point the way. They couldn't dig. They couldn't confirm. They couldn't turn anomalies into artifacts or data into proof. Someone still had to go down into the desert, find the spot the machines had flagged, and put shovels into the sand. And that someone was about to step forward, a filmmaker with no archaeological credentials, but an obsession that would prove more valuable than any degree. Enter Nicholas Clapp, a documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles, not an archaeologist, not a desert explorer, not anyone you would expect to be chasing a ghost city across the most lethal landscape on Earth. He had no academic credentials that would give him permission to hunt for ancient ruins, no institutional backing, no specialized training in reading stratigraphy or identifying potsherds. What he had was something that often proves more powerful than all of those things combined: an obsession. The seed had been planted years earlier, almost by accident. Clapp had stumbled across references to Ubar while researching another project, and the story had burrowed into his brain like a parasite that refused to leave. Here was a city mentioned in the Quran, referenced by medieval geographers, whispered about by Bedouin tribes, a place so wealthy and so wicked that God had erased it from the earth as punishment. And nobody had found it. Not Thomas, not Thesiger, not any of the hardened explorers who had spent decades mastering the empty quarter. The legend haunted him. He would wake up thinking about buried pillars under starless skies. He would find himself distracted in conversations, his mind drifting to caravan routes and frankincense, and the mechanics of divine destruction. Most people who encounter a story like Ubar treat it as a curiosity, a fascinating myth, maybe a good topic for a dinner party conversation. Clapp treated it as a personal summons. The city was out there waiting, and it had chosen him to find it. The problem was that he had no idea where to start. The historical texts were frustratingly vague, as they always are. The Quranic account of Iram offered no coordinates. The medieval geographers placed Ubar somewhere in the southern Arabian desert, which covered an area roughly the size of a small country. The Bedouin stories were poetic but useless for navigation, pointing to general regions rather than specific sites. Clapp could have wandered the Rub al-Khali for years without finding anything, and he was smart enough to know it. So instead of packing a backpack and heading into the desert to die, he did something that no previous Ubar hunter had attempted. He went to the library. Not just any library. He dove into archival collections across the world, tracking down every reference to Ubar, Iram, and the Frankincense trade he could find. Ancient geographical texts, medieval maps, colonial expedition reports. Oral histories recorded by anthropologists. He treated the legend like a crime scene and himself like a detective, gathering every fragment of evidence, every witness statement, every circumstantial clue that might point toward the victim's final resting place. The texts gave him something the oral traditions alone never could. A pattern. He noticed that multiple sources written centuries apart by authors who had no knowledge of each other kept pointing toward the same general region. Not just anywhere in the empty quarter, but a specific area near its western edge, where the desert met the more habitable zones of southern Oman. The convergence was subtle. You had to read dozens of documents side by side to see it. But once Clapp saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The witnesses were agreeing. They just didn't know it, but textual analysis could only narrow the search so far. Clapp still needed eyes on the ground, or rather eyes above it. This was where his outsider status became an unexpected advantage. Professional archaeologists had their methods, their traditions, their institutional constraints. Clapp had none of those. He had a filmmaker's instinct for visual storytelling and a hobbyist's willingness to try anything that might work. So he wrote to NASA. The letter must have seemed absurd when it arrived at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Some documentary guy in California wants you to point your multi-million-dollar satellite sensors at a mythical city in the Arabian desert, because an old book told him it might be there. The scientists could have ignored him. They could have politely explained that their equipment was designed for real science, not for chasing legends. Instead, they listened. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they saw a chance for interesting public relations. Maybe they just respected the meticulous research Clapp had packaged with his request. For whatever reason, they agreed to look. The satellite data was a revelation. Those ancient caravan tracks converging on specific points in the desert, the spectral anomalies suggesting buried structures, they transformed Clapp's literary research into a physical target. He now had coordinates. He had the fossilized circulatory system of the frankincense trade, pointing like arrows toward the organs it had sustained. The convergence of textual evidence and satellite imagery was too precise to be coincidental. Something was down there, but finding it required boots on the ground, and Clapp was a filmmaker, not an expedition leader. He needed a team, real archaeologists, real scientists, people who could turn his obsession into legitimate fieldwork. He assembled a coalition that would have seemed impossible given his lack of credentials. Juris Zarins, an archaeologist with experience in the Arabian Peninsula who brought academic rigour and field expertise. Ronald Blom, a NASA geologist who could interpret the satellite data on site. A team of Omanis who understood the local terrain, the culture and the politics of working in a country that had no particular reason to trust a bunch of foreigners claiming they wanted to dig up a cursed city. The expedition had the feel of a patched-together operation, a filmmaker's dream backed by NASA technology and led by a professional archaeologist who was probably wondering whether he was making the biggest mistake of his career or the most important discovery of his life. The tension during the preparation phase was extraordinary. Clapp had staked his reputation, his time, and a significant portion of his sanity on this project. Zarins had committed professional credibility that could be destroyed if they found nothing but sand. The NASA scientists had invested resources and attention that could have been deployed on more conventional projects. Everyone was riding on a hypothesis that was still fundamentally uncertain. The texts pointed here, the satellites pointed here. But the desert had swallowed 1,000 settlements without leaving a trace, and Ubar could be another one, a city that existed and died, and would never be found because it had been erased too completely for even orbital sensors to detect. They were chasing a ghost, and they all knew it. The difference between them and every previous searcher was that they had better equipment for ghost hunting. The expedition launched. They drove into the desert following coordinates that had been generated by machines orbiting 300 miles above the Earth, guided by research that had been compiled in libraries thousands of miles away from any sand dune. The landscape was exactly as brutal as every explorer had described. Endless heat, blinding light, terrain that seemed designed to kill humans who ventured into it without absolute respect for its rules. But they weren't wandering, they were targeting. They knew where they were going and they knew what they were looking for, even if they didn't yet know whether it was actually there. Every mile deeper into the empty quarter increased the stakes. Finding nothing out here wouldn't just be disappointing. It would mean the texts were wrong, the satellites were misleading, and all of them had wasted months of their lives pursuing a story that was nothing more than a bedtime tale for desert nomads. But finding something, finding walls, finding artifacts, finding the physical remains of a city that had been erased from human memory for 1,000 years, that would change everything. That would prove that legends sometimes carry truth inside them, wrapped in mythology like a pearl inside an oyster, waiting for someone willing to crack the shell open and look past the surface. They found it, or at least they found something. The coordinates led them to a place called Shisr, a tiny, forgettable settlement in southern Oman. The kind of place you would drive past without a second glance. A few scattered buildings, a modest well that local herders used to water their goats. Nothing that would make you stop and think, this is where a legendary civilization once stood. But Nicholas Clapp and Juris Sarins weren't looking at the surface. They were looking at what the satellites had promised them, the spectral anomalies hidden beneath the sand, the ghostly signatures of something that had been buried for centuries. And Shisr sat exactly at the centre of those anomalies, like a bullseye drawn by ancient caravan routes converging from every direction. The initial excavation process was a careful, agonizing dance between hope and science. You can't just walk into the desert and start digging holes like a treasure hunter. Zarins knew this. Archaeology is about reading the earth in reverse, peeling back layers of time without destroying the story embedded in the soil. They started with survey grids mapping the surface, recording every fragment of pottery, every shard of glass, every piece of worked stone that might indicate human activity beneath the dunes. The local Bedouin watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Foreigners with NASA maps and American funding poking around a well that their grandparents had used for generations. The Bedouin oral traditions had always pointed to this region as the home of the cursed city, but pointing to a region and finding a city are two very different things. For centuries the stories had been enough. Now, for the first time, someone was demanding physical proof. As the team began to excavate, the desert started to surrender its secrets, slowly, grudgingly, like a suspect who knows the interrogator has leverage but isn't ready to confess. Beneath the modern surface, they found collapsed walls. Not the foundations of the modest modern settlement, but something older, something built with techniques and materials that didn't belong to the present inhabitants. The stones were massive, fitted together with a precision that suggested experienced hands and organized labor, not the casual construction of nomadic herders. The deeper they dug, the clearer the architecture became. And then they hit the breakthrough that changed everything. They identified an octagonal fortress structure, an octagon. 8 sides, 8 walls radiating outward from a central point. This wasn't a random settlement or a temporary way station for passing caravans. This was a fortress, a statement of power and permanence, a structure designed to dominate the landscape, and protect something valuable enough to justify walls thick enough to withstand siege engines. The octagonal shape itself carried significance. In ancient Arabian architecture, such designs were rare but not unknown, often associated with defensive installations that needed to provide visibility and firing angles in every direction. A square fortress has blind spots at its corners. An octagonal fortress sees everything approaching from the desert, a watchtower that never sleeps, a guardian of the incense roads that demanded both vigilance and strength. The dimensions were impressive. The walls suggested a substantial military presence, or at least the desire to project one. This wasn't just a place where merchants stopped to rest. This was a stronghold that controlled the flow of frankincense from the interior to the coast, a customs house with defences, a gatekeeper that decided who passed and who was turned away into the killing desert. But the fortress alone wasn't enough to confirm the identity of the site. Fortresses had existed all across ancient Arabia. What made Shisr special, what tied it to the legend of Ubar with a cord that couldn't be easily dismissed, was what they found at the centre of that octagon. A well, not a modern well dug by contemporary herders, but an ancient well, deep, expertly constructed, lined with stone, and designed to tap into a water source that had sustained life in this corner of the empty quarter for millennia. In the desert, water is everything. A well isn't just a convenience. It's the reason a settlement exists at all. The well at Shisr was the anchor that held the fortress in place, the magnet that drew caravan routes from across the peninsula, the secret that made this otherwise inhospitable location into a hub of international trade. Every frankincense caravan heading north needed water. Every merchant carrying precious resin toward the Mediterranean markets needed a reliable stopping point where their animals could drink and their goods could be secured. The well at Shisr provided that lifeline, and whoever controlled the well controlled the trade. It was a choke point, a geographic monopoly disguised as a charitable water source. You don't charge for frankincense itself when you're the only place with water between the mountains and the coast. You charge for access to the well. You charge for protection while your customers recover from the desert crossing. You charge for everything because your customers have no alternative. The empty quarter doesn't negotiate. It kills anyone who tries to bypass the water. This was the economic engine that had built the legendary wealth of Ubar. Not the frankincense trees themselves, but the control of the passage that made their exploitation possible. The announcement of the discovery hit the archaeological world like a meteorite. Media outlets from every continent descended on the tiny site, transforming a careful scientific excavation into a global spectacle. The headlines were sensational and sometimes irresponsible. Lost city of Ubar found. Atlantis of the sands discovered. Quranic legend confirmed. The reality was more nuanced, as reality always is, but nuance doesn't sell newspapers or generate clicks. The excitement was genuine, though, even among the scientists who usually resist hype. Zarins and Clapp had done something that decades of professional explorers had failed to accomplish. They had identified a substantial ancient settlement at the exact location where multiple lines of evidence converged, textual, oral, and technological. Whether that settlement was definitively the Ubar of legend remained a question that would require years of additional research to answer responsibly. But the octagonal fortress and the ancient well were real. The caravan routes converging on Shisr were real. The evidence that this place had been a major node in the frankincense trade network was real. Something important had happened here, something that the desert had preserved for over 1,000 years, waiting for someone with the right combination of obsession, technology, and scientific discipline to uncover it. So they had the fortress, they had the well, but a fortress without artifacts is just a pile of rocks, and a well without evidence of the people who drank from it is just a hole in the ground. The real story of Shisr, The story that could confirm or deny whether this was truly the legendary Ubar wasn't written in stone walls. It was written in the things people left behind, the everyday objects that fall between floorboards, get dropped in courtyards, get buried when buildings collapse, the trash and treasures of daily life that archaeologists call the material record. And what they found beneath those octagonal walls was extraordinary. The pottery came first. Not just a few scattered shards, but dense concentrations of ceramic fragments that spanned centuries of human occupation. This wasn't one style, one period, one brief moment in time. It was a timeline written in clay. The earliest layers contained simple, hand-formed vessels, crude but functional. The kind of pottery you'd expect from a small settlement just figuring out how to make containers that hold water without leaking. But as the layers moved upward through time, the pottery became increasingly sophisticated. Wheel-made ceramics appeared, thinner walls, more uniform shapes, decorative elements that suggested not just local production but connection to wider artistic traditions. And then came the imports. Pieces that matched pottery styles from distant regions, vessels that had been carried across hundreds of miles of desert by camel caravan, ceramic evidence that this place wasn't isolated, wasn't just a local outpost struggling to survive. It was connected, cosmopolitan, a node in a network that stretched across the ancient world. The coins told an even more dramatic story. Currency is the fingerprint of trade, and the coins recovered from Shisr bore fingerprints from places that would have seemed impossibly distant to anyone living in that desert fortress. Roman coins. Coins from the Himyarite kingdom in Yemen. Coins from the Parthian Empire, the great rival of Rome that controlled much of what we now call Iran and Iraq. Even coins from as far away as India, tiny bronze and silver pieces that had travelled trade routes, spanning thousands of miles before ending up in the sand above an ancient well in southern Oman. Think about what that means. A merchant from Rome, or at least someone carrying Roman money, had stood in this fortress. Indian traders had passed through these gates. Parthian businessmen had negotiated deals in these courtyards. The coins proved that Shisr wasn't just a regional market serving local nomads and their goats. It was an international trading hub, a place where the wealth of multiple empires converged before being redistributed across the incense roads. And then there was the frankincense itself. Or rather, the evidence of it, because organic resin doesn't survive well in archaeological contexts. What survived were the tools associated with frankincense production and trade, specialized containers designed to hold and transport the precious resin, processing equipment that suggested the raw material was being refined here, not just passed through, weights and measures that would have been essential for fair trade in a commodity where every gram had value. And perhaps most revealing, the remains of storage facilities, secure rooms within the fortress where high-value goods could be kept under guard before being shipped north to the markets of the Mediterranean world. This wasn't a toll booth on a desert highway. This was a warehouse, a processing center, a distribution hub, the heart of an industry that had made ancient Arabia wealthy beyond the comprehension of ordinary people. The architecture reinforced this picture of permanence and sophistication. Those octagonal walls weren't the work of amateurs. They were constructed using techniques that suggested professional builders, organized labor forces, and significant investment. The stone work showed evidence of careful selection and fitting, blocks chosen for their shape and size, then worked to create stable, load-bearing walls that could withstand both military attack and the slow, relentless assault of desert weather. The towers at the corners of the octagon weren't decorative. They were functional military installations, elevated positions for watchers who could spot approaching caravans or threats from miles away across the flat desert landscape. Inside the fortress, the layout revealed a sophisticated understanding of both defense and daily life. Living quarters separated from storage areas, public spaces distinct from private ones, a hierarchy of spaces that suggested a hierarchy of people, not just a band of equals sharing a shelter, but a structured community with different roles and different access to different parts of the complex. This was the crucial evidence that distinguished permanent habitation from temporary occupation. A trade post, a seasonal way station where merchants stopped for a few days before moving on, leaves a different archaeological signature than a settled community. Trade posts have minimal architecture, temporary shelters, lean-to structures that can be abandoned without loss. They have limited pottery diversity, whatever the current travellers are carrying. They have few signs of investment in infrastructure. No one builds massive stone walls and deep wells for a place they're planning to leave next season. Shisr had all the markers of permanence. The architecture was built to last generations, not seasons. The pottery showed continuous occupation across centuries, not intermittent visits. The presence of manufacturing activities, pottery production, metalworking, textile processing, indicated that people weren't just passing through. They were making things here. They were living here. They were raising children here. This was home. And when you compared these findings to the ancient legends, the parallels were striking. The Quranic description of Iram of the Pillars, a city of lofty architecture and substantial buildings, didn't match a collection of tents or a temporary caravan stop. It matched a fortress with towers and thick walls. The classical accounts of Ubar as a major trading centre, controlling the frankincense routes, didn't match a minor watering hole. They matched an international hub where coins from Rome and India changed hands. The descriptions of Ubar's wealth and power, the sense that this was a place that mattered in the ancient world, a place worth mentioning in texts spanning thousands of years and multiple cultures, they matched what the archaeology was revealing. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to make you wonder whether those ancient storytellers had known something that modern skeptics had forgotten. What these artifacts revealed about daily life was perhaps the most human part of the story. Behind the grand architecture and the international trade, behind the military defences and the economic monopoly, there were people. People who ate from those locally made bowls, people who used those imported vessels as status symbols or practical tools, people who carried those coins in their pockets, or whatever ancient Arabian merchants used instead of pockets, and thought about what they could buy with them. People who processed frankincense day after day, their hands sticky with resin that was worth more than their weight in gold in distant markets they would never see. People who lived in those quarters inside the fortress, some in better rooms, some in worse ones. People who climbed those towers to watch the desert, not because they wanted to, but because someone had decided that their job was to stand in the sun and look for approaching threats. The artifacts weren't just objects, they were echoes of lives, fragments of the daily existence of a community that had thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, not by surviving it, but by mastering it, by building walls against it, by digging wells beneath it, by making the desert itself work for them rather than against them. So we have the fortress, the international coins, the frankincense processing equipment, the centuries of continuous occupation. We have a place that mattered, a place that drew merchants from Rome and India to a patch of desert that most people would consider uninhabitable. But the question that really gets people's attention, the question that makes this more than just another archaeological site in another forgotten corner of the ancient world, is a question about time. How old is this place really? And the answer, depending on how you interpret the evidence, might rewrite our understanding of when civilization started getting serious in this part of the world. Let's lay out what the excavations suggest. The earliest occupation layers at Shisr, the deepest levels that archaeologists reached before hitting natural substrate, contained pottery and artifacts that point to human activity at this site as far back as somewhere in the 3rd millennium BCE, possibly earlier. The exact dates are debated, and we'll get to why in a moment, but some researchers have proposed dates pushing toward the late 4th millennium BCE for the earliest use of this location as a settled or semi-settled outpost. That's rough territory, 3000 BCE, maybe 3500 BCE, maybe earlier still, if you interpret certain fragmentary evidence more aggressively. These are estimates based on ceramic typology and stratigraphic analysis, not carbon dates printed on official certificates, and the distinction matters enormously. Now let's put that timeline next to Egypt, because that's the comparison everyone makes when they hear about an ancient Arabian city. The early Egyptian dynasties, the period when Egypt was transitioning from scattered pre-dynastic communities into a unified state capable of monumental architecture and complex administration, were consolidating around 3100 to 3000 BCE. The First Dynasty, the period when pharaohs began ruling a united Egypt and building the institutions we associate with Egyptian civilization, falls right in that window. The pyramids came later, much later. The Great Pyramid at Giza around 2560 BCE. But the foundations of Egyptian power, the agricultural systems, the administrative structures, the cultural identity that would make Egypt the dominant civilization of the ancient Mediterranean world were being laid down during that late 4th to early 3rd millennium period. So when someone says Shisr might be older than Egypt, what they're really comparing is the earliest occupation at this desert outpost to the earliest political consolidation in the Nile Valley. And if you take the more aggressive dating estimates for Shisr, if you push that earliest activity back toward 3500 BCE or beyond, then yes, technically, people were living at this site, drawing water from this well, making pottery in this location, before the First Dynasty pharaohs were crowning themselves in Memphis. But that comparison hides a massive difference in what these places actually were at those early dates. Egypt in 3500 BCE was already developing writing, already building large-scale irrigation systems, already creating administrative structures that could organize labor forces of thousands of people. Shisr in 3500 BCE, based on the evidence we actually have, was probably a small settlement around a reliable water source, a place where nomadic groups could stop and resupply, where early pastoralists could water their animals, where the first tentative steps toward permanent desert occupation were being taken. Calling that older than Egypt is like saying a roadside rest stop is older than a skyscraper because someone first pulled over at that location before the skyscraper's foundation was poured. Technically accurate maybe, but fundamentally misleading about what each place actually represented at that moment in history. The challenges of dating desert sites make this whole discussion even more complicated. Carbon dating requires organic material, wood, bone, charcoal, plant fibers, things that preserve poorly in hot, dry environments, where decomposition happens fast, and then the remaining fragments get scattered by wind and sand. Shisr's earliest layers yielded frustratingly little material suitable for radiocarbon analysis. Most of the dating has relied on pottery comparison, matching the styles and manufacturing techniques found at Shisr to better dated examples from other sites in the region. But this method has limits. Pottery styles spread unevenly, they get adopted at different times in different places. They persist longer in isolated communities than in cosmopolitan ones. A pottery type that was fashionable in Mesopotamia in 3200 BCE might not have reached southern Oman until 2800 BCE, or it might have arrived earlier through trade contacts we don't fully understand. Every date derived from ceramic comparison carries a margin of error that can stretch across centuries, and for a site where the earliest occupation might span 1,000 years or more, those margins matter. Desert archaeology also faces a problem that researchers call the visibility gap. Early desert settlements were often built from materials that don't survive well. Mud brick, organic frameworks, tent structures, temporary shelters that served their purpose, and then return to the sand without leaving substantial traces. A community could have lived at Shisr for generations during those earliest periods, building and rebuilding with materials that archaeologists would struggle to detect 2,000 years later, leaving only the faintest signatures in the soil. The pottery survives because it's fired ceramic, practically indestructible once it's buried. The architecture we found dates from the fortress period, the later phases when the community had grown wealthy enough to invest in stone walls and permanent structures. But the earlier phases, the ones that might push the occupation date back toward those headline-grabbing comparisons with Egypt, remain partially hidden in the archaeological record. We know people were there. We don't know exactly what they built, how many of them stayed, or how permanent their presence really was. What does older than Egypt actually mean in this context? It means that humans recognized the value of this water source and this defensive position at a remarkably early date, before the great civilizations of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia had fully crystallized into the forms we recognize from textbooks. It means the incense roads, the trade networks that would eventually make Ubar wealthy and famous, may have begun forming earlier than we previously assumed, as nomadic groups discovered that certain desert locations could support regular occupation if you approached them correctly. It does not necessarily mean that a sophisticated city, the Iram of the pillars described in the Quran, was standing in the Arabian desert while pharaohs were still figuring out how to write hieroglyphs. The legendary city, if it existed as described, almost certainly dates from a much later period. The Iron Age, the era of the frankincense boom, the time when the trade routes had matured into international highways and the fortress at Shisr had evolved into something genuinely impressive. So we should feel the excitement without surrendering to it. The possibility that Shisr's earliest occupation predates Egyptian political consolidation is genuinely thrilling. It suggests that the Arabian Peninsula was not just an empty space waiting to be discovered by more advanced civilizations from elsewhere, but a place where indigenous communities were developing their own approaches to settled life at the same time, or even slightly before their neighbours in the Nile Valley were doing the same thing, just under vastly different conditions and with vastly different results. But we should also maintain the caution that the evidence demands. These are debated estimates, not established facts. The dating methods carry significant uncertainties. The comparison between a small desert outpost and a developing river valley civilization obscures more than it reveals about what each place actually achieved at those early dates. The claim that Ubar is older than Egypt is provocative, it's attention-grabbing, and it might contain a kernel of truth worth pursuing. But kernels of truth and fully grown truth are different things, and in archaeology, especially desert archaeology, the distance between them can be measured in centuries of patient, careful, frustrating work that hasn't been completed yet. So we've established the timeline, the debate about how old this place really is, the cautious excitement about what those early dates might mean. But there's another question that haunts this site, a question that takes us away from chronology and pushes us straight into geology and catastrophe. How did Ubar fall? Not gradually, not through the slow decline that claims most ancient cities when trade routes shift or empires lose their grip. This city appears to have died suddenly, violently, swallowed by the earth itself, and the explanation for that disappearance might be the most compelling part of the entire story. Here's what the geologists found when they started examining the site at Shisr. Beneath the fortress, beneath the walls and the towers and the trading posts that had served merchants from Rome to India, there was a void, not a metaphorical void, not the absence of history that archaeologists usually encounter when they reach the bottom of their excavation units. An actual physical hole in the ground, a massive sinkhole, roughly circular, stretching across much of the area where the fortress once stood. The limestone that forms the bedrock of this region is the kind of limestone that develops caverns over time. Rainwater, even the rare and sparse rainwater of southern Arabia, slowly percolates through cracks in the stone. It dissolves the calcium carbonate, carving out underground chambers, creating spaces where solid rock used to be. This process takes thousands of years, millions of years, operating at a pace that makes human lifetimes seem instantaneous. But it creates something dangerous. It creates a ceiling of rock suspended over an empty space, waiting for the right conditions to collapse. That's what appears to have happened at Shisr. The fortress was built directly above one of these underground caverns, probably without anyone knowing it existed. Why would they? The water source that made this location valuable, the well that drew travellers from across the desert, was itself a window into that underground world. The well worked because it tapped into the water table, the water that had collected in the limestone caverns below. People drew from it for centuries, probably for millennia, never realizing that every bucket of water they pulled up was slowly, invisibly undermining the ground beneath their feet. But the water extraction wasn't the only factor. The geologists and archaeologists who studied the collapse have proposed that the scale of occupation at Shisr may have accelerated the instability. Think about what a thriving desert outpost requires. You have merchants and their caravans, hundreds of camels and donkeys needing water. You have permanent residents maintaining the fortress and the trade infrastructure. You have passing nomadic groups stopping to resupply. All of them are drawing from the same source, the same underground reservoir that exists because the limestone beneath the site has been hollowed out by geological processes operating on timescales no human could comprehend. The more water they pulled, the more they reduced the pressure that was helping support the cavern ceiling. Water fills spaces. It provides hydrostatic pressure that pushes against rock walls. Remove enough of that water, and you remove part of what was holding the structure together. Add the weight of a substantial fortress built directly above this underground void, stone walls, towers, stored goods, packed earth floors, dozens or possibly hundreds of people moving around inside the walls, and you've created conditions for a disaster that nobody could have predicted. The collapse, when it finally came, would have been sudden and catastrophic. Sinkholes don't give warning. The rock ceiling fails all at once, dropping whatever is above it into the void below. Imagine standing in the fortress at Shisr on what seems like an ordinary day. Merchants are haggling over frankincense prices, camels are being watered at the well, guards are patrolling the walls, and then, in an instant, without any sound of cracking or slow subsidence that might have given people time to flee, a section of ground simply drops. Not a small section, a massive circular area encompassing much of the fortress interior. The walls buckle as the earth beneath them disappears. Buildings tilt, then slide, then fall into the hole. People who were standing on solid ground moments earlier find themselves tumbling into a crater that wasn't there before. The well, the lifeline that had sustained this community for generations, would have been at the centre of the collapse or swallowed by it entirely. This is where the connection to legend becomes electrifying. The Quran describes Iram of the pillars being destroyed by divine punishment, a catastrophic event sent by God to obliterate a wicked city. Local folklore across the Arabian Peninsula tells similar stories of a city that was swallowed, erased, removed from the surface of the earth as if it had never existed. For centuries, these accounts were read as moral tales, religious narratives designed to warn against hubris and impiety. The idea that a city could literally disappear into the ground seemed fantastical, the kind of thing that belongs in myth rather than history. But the sinkhole collapse theory changed that interpretation entirely. What if the divine punishment described in sacred texts was actually a natural disaster that ancient observers interpreted through a religious lens? What if the city's destruction was so sudden, so total, so inexplicable to people who didn't understand limestone geology and hydrostatic pressure, that the only framework they had for explaining it was divine wrath? This theory reshaped how researchers understand the fall of Ubar in several crucial ways. First, it provided a mechanism. Cities don't usually disappear overnight. They decline, they get abandoned, they get conquered, they get rebuilt on top of their own ruins. But Ubar appears to have ended in a single catastrophic event, and Sinkhole collapse explains how that could happen without requiring invading armies or sudden economic catastrophes. Second, it connected the archaeological evidence to the literary traditions in a way that neither archaeology nor textual analysis could have accomplished alone. The geologists found the sinkhole. The historians had the stories of a swallowed city. Only by combining both could the full picture emerge. Third, it revealed something profound about how ancient people understood their world. When the ground opens up and eats a city, when solid rock becomes a void and an entire community vanishes in moments, the people who survive that event, or who hear about it from survivors, will search for meaning. They will reach for explanations that make sense within their worldview. And in a worldview where divine forces actively shaped human fate, where natural disasters were understood as expressions of supernatural will, the idea that God destroyed this city for its sins wasn't primitive superstition. It was the most logical interpretation available to people who had no access to geological science. The sinkhole theory doesn't diminish the religious significance of the story. If anything, it enhances it by showing how real physical catastrophes can generate narratives that carry moral and spiritual weight across millennia. The city was destroyed by geology, but it was remembered by theology. And that combination, the intersection of measurable physical processes and enduring human meaning, is what makes Ubar's story resonate far beyond the boundaries of southern Arabia. So, a city swallowed by the earth, destroyed in what must have seemed like an instant to the people living there, preserved in sacred texts as divine punishment for human arrogance. If that description sounds familiar, it should. It's essentially the same narrative framework that drives the most famous lost city story in Western civilization. Atlantis, a prosperous, powerful civilization, a catastrophic destruction, a disappearance so complete that later generations questioned whether the place had ever existed at all. When news of the Shisr excavation broke in the early 1990s, journalists and documentary producers almost immediately reached for the same comparison. They called Ubar the Atlantis of the sands. The nickname stuck fast. It appeared in magazine headlines, television specials, book titles. It became the shorthand that everyone used to explain what this discovery meant. And honestly, you can understand why. The parallels are striking enough to make any storyteller's pulse quicken. Both cities were described as wealthy beyond normal comprehension. Atlantis controlled trade routes across the Atlantic world, according to Plato. Ubar sat at the nexus of the incense roads, commanding access to a commodity that ancient economies valued as highly as gold. Both were said to have been destroyed by a single catastrophic event, not the slow decline of trade or the gradual erosion of political power, but something sudden, total, annihilating. Both vanished so thoroughly that their existence became a matter of debate rather than established fact. Plato's account of Atlantis comes from Egyptian priests who claimed the story had been passed down for thousands of years. The Quran's account of Iram comes from divine revelation, but echoes oral traditions that had circulated across Arabia for generations. Both narratives carry moral weight. Atlantis falls because its people become corrupt, greedy, warlike. Iram falls because its inhabitants reject divine guidance and embrace wickedness. The destruction isn't random, it's earned. But here's where the comparison starts to break down, and where paying attention to the differences matters just as much as noticing the similarities. Atlantis, as Plato describes it, is an imperial power. A maritime civilization with fleets of ships, conquered territories, and sophisticated engineering projects, canals, bridges, elaborate architectural complexes. It's a superpower, or at least Plato's imaginative projection of what a superpower would look like in the ancient Mediterranean. Ubar was never that. The archaeological evidence from Shisr points toward a fortified caravanserai, a trading outpost, a waypoint on a network of routes connecting producers in the southern Arabian highlands with consumers in Rome, Persia, India, and points beyond. It was important, probably very wealthy by the standards of its region and era, but it wasn't running a navy or projecting military power across continents. It was a node in a network, not the centre of an empire. The scale differs too. Plato's Atlantis is enormous. A massive island continent, with multiple cities, elaborate agricultural systems, and a population that Plato inflates to absurd proportions. Shisr covers a few acres. The fortress walls enclose a space that could probably hold a few hundred people at maximum capacity, along with their animals and their trade goods. This isn't a continent sinking beneath the waves. It's a trading post collapsing into a sinkhole, important in its context, significant for what it tells us about ancient trade and settlement in one of the world's harshest environments, but not the kind of civilization that rewrites global history. The destruction mechanisms differ as well. Atlantis sinks into the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophic flooding, possibly triggered by earthquakes or tsunamis, according to Plato's account. Ubar collapses into a subterranean void created by limestone geology and accelerated by centuries of water extraction. One is a marine disaster, the other is a geological one operating in a desert environment where water exists underground, not on the surface. These are fundamentally different physical processes, even though they produce similarly total results. So why did the Atlantis comparison become so dominant? Why did media coverage almost universally gravitate toward this particular framing rather than more precise archaeological descriptions? The answer has less to do with the site itself, and more to do with the deep cultural power of lost civilization narratives. Atlantis isn't just a story about a city that disappeared. It's a template, a narrative archetype that Western culture has been recycling for over 2,000 years. From Plato's original dialogue through 19th century speculative archaeology, through 20th century pulp fiction and film, the idea of an advanced civilization that existed before recorded history and was destroyed by its own hubris has become one of the most durable storytelling frameworks in European and American culture. It combines several psychological hooks that humans find almost irresistible: the mystery of disappearance, the promise of hidden knowledge, the moral lesson about pride preceding destruction, the fantasy that somewhere out there beneath the ocean or under the desert or inside a jungle canopy, there are ruins that could rewrite everything we think we know about the past. When you attach that framework to a real archaeological discovery, you get a powerful amplification effect. Ubar wasn't just an interesting excavation in southern Arabia anymore. It was Atlantis. It was proof that the lost civilization template wasn't just myth, that real cities could vanish so thoroughly that they became legends, that the ground beneath our feet might still hold secrets waiting to reshape our understanding of human history. That framing drove enormous public interest. Documentary crews descended on Shisr. Book contracts were signed. Funding flowed from sources that might never have supported a straightforward archaeological project in the empty quarter, but were eager to back the search for Atlantis of the Sands. The nickname became a brand, and the brand became a machine for generating attention and resources. But some archaeologists and historians pushed back against this framing, and their concerns deserve serious consideration. Romanticizing archaeological finds by attaching them to mythological templates can distort both the evidence and the public's understanding of what that evidence actually shows. Calling Ubar the Atlantis of the Sands implies a kind of equivalence between a regional trading outpost and a mythological superpower. It encourages people to imagine Shisr as something it wasn't, to project expectations onto the site that the physical evidence doesn't support. When visitors or readers come to the story expecting continent-spanning empires and apocalyptic maritime disasters, the actual archaeology, a limestone sinkhole, a fortified caravanserai, trade goods from known historical networks, can feel underwhelming by comparison. The real history gets overshadowed by the mythological overlay. There's also a risk of what scholars call presentism, projecting contemporary narrative desires onto ancient material and reading the evidence in ways that confirm those desires rather than letting the evidence speak for itself. The Atlantis comparison encourages exactly this kind of projection. It asks us to see Ubar through a lens shaped by Plato and Hollywood rather than through the lenses of Arabian geography, frankincense economics, and limestone geology. Those latter lenses produce a story that's genuinely fascinating without any mythological embellishment. A community that figured out how to thrive in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. A trade network that connected the Mediterranean world with southern Arabia and beyond. A geological catastrophe that destroyed centuries of accumulated infrastructure in moments and generated stories that persisted for thousands of years. That story is remarkable on its own terms. It doesn't need to be Atlantis to matter. The branding also created expectations that the site couldn't fulfill. When early reports suggested that Shisr might date back to the Neolithic period, older than Egypt's pyramid-building civilization, those claims got amplified through the Atlantis framework. The narrative became not just a lost city, but a lost city that was ancient before the ancient world was ancient. As we discussed earlier, those early dates remain contested. Responsible archaeologists argue for more modest chronologies that still place Ubar among the important early settlements of southern Arabia, but don't push the timeline back into territory where the evidence becomes uncertain. The Atlantis framing doesn't have room for that kind of caution. It wants maximum drama, maximum mystery, maximum disruption to establish timelines. And when the evidence doesn't quite deliver on those desires, the resulting disappointment can undermine legitimate appreciation for what the site actually tells us. So, what was life actually like in this place? Not the mythological Atlantis of the sands, but the real fortified outpost sitting on the edge of the world's most punishing desert. The archaeological evidence gives us fragments, frustratingly incomplete, but enough to start piecing together a picture that's fascinating precisely because it's so constrained by extreme reality. Let's start with the social structure, or rather what we can guess about it. We don't have written records from Ubar itself. No royal decrees, no tax ledgers, no diaries of merchant princes. What we have is architecture, and architecture speaks. The fortress at Shisr wasn't a palace. It wasn't a temple complex. It was a defensive enclosure, thick walls designed to protect what was inside from what was outside. And what was inside was trade wealth, frankincense, the resin that ancient economies valued as highly as gold, stored in bulk, waiting for caravans to carry it north toward the Mediterranean and Persian markets. The fortress tells us that whoever controlled this place understood exactly how valuable their cargo was, and exactly how vulnerable they were while holding it. This strongly suggests a society organized around trade protection, rather than imperial projection. We're probably looking at something like a powerful merchant family, or a small council of trade elites who managed the outpost's operations. Think of it as a castle on the Silk Road, but in Arabia. The people in charge weren't commanding armies or governing territories. They were securing supply lines, negotiating with nomadic tribes who controlled the desert passages, and making sure the frankincense got from the highlands where it grew to the caravans that would carry it to distant markets. Their authority came from wealth and strategic positioning, not from military dominance or divine right. At least, that's the most plausible interpretation. But we have to be honest. The governance structure remains an open question. Maybe there was a tribal chieftain whose authority extended across multiple routes. Maybe a coalition of families shared power. Maybe someone we have no evidence for held sway in ways we can't imagine. The silence in the record keeps us guessing. Then there's the population question, and this one really drives archaeologists up the wall. How many people actually lived here? The enclosed area of the Shisr fortress could probably hold a few hundred residents at maximum capacity, along with their animals and stored goods. But maximum capacity isn't normal capacity. The permanent population might have been much smaller, maybe 50 to 100 people. The core staff needed to run the outpost year-round. Then, during peak trade season, when caravans arrived and the incense harvest came in, the population could swell dramatically. Temporary workers, passing merchants, guards hired for specific shipments. The site would have pulsed with activity, dense and chaotic during trading months, sparse and quiet during the off-season. But we don't know the actual numbers. We don't have enough residential structures identified to make confident estimates. The population could have been larger than the current excavated area, suggests if settlements spread beyond the fortress walls, or it could have been smaller if the site served mainly as a storage and transfer point rather than a full-time community. This ambiguity is maddening, but it's also realistic. Ancient settlements don't always leave neat population signatures. What we can say with more confidence is that Ubar existed within a web of trade relationships that connected it to cultures across the ancient world. The artifacts found at Shisr include pottery fragments that match styles from Mesopotamia, materials that trace back to the Indus Valley region, and remnants of Roman amphora. This wasn't an isolated desert outpost scrabbling for survival. This was a node in an international network. The people living here weren't just surviving. They were engaging, they were receiving goods from distant civilizations, repacking them, sending them onward. They spoke multiple languages, or at least developed trade pidgins sufficient for negotiation. They understood market values in Rome and Persia and India, even if they never visited those places themselves. The trade relationships weren't just economic, they were cultural exchange points. Ideas, technologies, stories moved along the same routes as the frankincense. Now, consider daily life, and this is where it gets really intense. You're living in a limestone fortress surrounded by the empty quarter. Temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Sandstorms can last for days. The nearest reliable surface water is, in many directions, hundreds of miles away. How do you survive? Water management becomes the single most critical technology. The people of Ubar depended on the groundwater that accumulated in the limestone aquifer beneath them. They dug wells deep into the stone, tapping into water that had percolated down from occasional rainfall over centuries. This wasn't a flowing spring you could just dip a bucket into. This was carefully maintained infrastructure that required constant attention. Wells needed to be kept clear of debris. Water levels needed to be monitored. Storage systems needed to prevent evaporation and contamination in an environment where every drop was precious. The sinkhole that eventually destroyed the site? That same limestone geology was what made the site possible in the first place. The underground water cavity that collapsed was the water source that had sustained the community for generations. They were literally living on top of their most essential resource, extracting it slowly over centuries until the extraction helped destabilize the ground above. Desert survival shaped every aspect of daily routine. Building techniques had to minimize heat gain during the day and retain warmth during surprisingly cold desert nights. Food preservation had to account for conditions where spoilage accelerated dramatically. Animal husbandry had to navigate scarce forage and water for camels, goats, and the other livestock that supported the trade operations. Clothing, schedule, social interaction, everything organized around the brutal rhythm of desert climate. Work happened early and late. Midday was for rest, for staying inside thick walls that provided shade. Social gatherings probably clustered around water sources and trade arrivals, the moments when the community came together around its two most vital lifelines. And then there were the caravans. Imagine the scene. A train of camels appearing on the horizon after days of travel across open desert. The animals loaded with frankincense resin, harvested in the southern highlands. The drivers exhausted, thirsty, desperate for water and rest. The fortress residents mobilizing, providing water from the precious wells, offering shelter inside the walls, taking custody of the cargo, weighing it, assessing its quality, storing it for the next phase of its journey north. These moments were the economic heartbeat of the settlement. Everything else, the construction, the defense, the daily survival routines existed to support this transaction. The fortress wasn't just protecting wealth, it was protecting the process by which wealth moved through one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. The open questions remain, though, and they're significant. We don't know how this community governed itself. We don't know exactly how many people called it home. We don't know the full extent of its trade connections or whether it maintained diplomatic relationships with regional powers. We don't know whether the residents saw themselves as permanent settlers or as transient operators managing a strategic waypoint. The fragments we have suggest a society shaped by trade, necessity, and desert reality, but the complete picture stays just out of reach, buried in the sand or collapsed into the sinkhole, or simply never recorded in a format that would survive millennia of abandonment. What we can say is this. The people of Ubar weren't mythical superhumans living in a paradise that arrogance destroyed. They were pragmatists, survivors, entrepreneurs operating at the absolute edge of what human settlement can sustain. And they made it work for a very long time. So what made all of this possible? What could possibly be valuable enough to justify building a fortified outpost in one of the most hostile environments on the planet, maintaining deep wells in limestone rock, and staffing a permanent settlement just to protect a shipment moving through the desert? The answer sounds almost mundane until you understand what it meant to the ancient world. Frankincense. Resin from trees that look like scraggly, twisted shrubs clinging to rocky hillsides. But in the ancient world, this resin wasn't just a commodity. It was the economic engine that built entire civilizations. To grasp why frankincense mattered so much, you have to understand the ancient relationship with the divine. Every significant religious practice across the Mediterranean and Near East, from Egyptian temple rituals to Roman state ceremonies to Jewish worship in the Second Temple, required incense. Not just any incense, frankincense specifically. When burned, it produces a white smoke that rises in steady, fragrant columns. To ancient minds, that smoke wasn't just pleasant. It was a physical bridge between the earthly realm and the heavens. You couldn't properly honor your gods without it. You couldn't perform the rituals that kept divine favor on your city, your empire, your harvest, your military campaigns. Frankincense was as essential to ancient religion as oil is to modern industry. The demand was relentless, and it came from every direction. Now, here's the critical constraint. Frankincense only grows in one place on Earth. The boswellia tree requires very specific conditions, arid climate, limestone soil, a particular pattern of seasonal moisture, found only in the highlands of southern Arabia and a small region of Somalia. You couldn't grow it in Egypt. You couldn't cultivate it in Rome. You couldn't transplant it to Mesopotamia. The trees simply refused to survive anywhere else. This geographic monopoly made the people who controlled the frankincense supply some of the most powerful merchants in the ancient world. If you wanted frankincense, you had to come to them. There was no alternative source, no competitor to drive down prices, no way to bypass their control of the product at its origin point. The harvesting process itself was delicate and labour-intensive. Workers would make precise incisions in the bark of boswellia trees during specific seasons, waiting for the milky white resin to exude and harden into tear-shaped drops over several weeks. The quality varied dramatically based on timing, tree health, and collection skill. Top-grade frankincense, the pure white, large tears with the most refined fragrance, commanded prices that could equal gold by weight in some markets. Lower grades were still valuable but fetched far less. This quality hierarchy created a sophisticated grading system that merchants had to master, assessing resin visually and by scent to determine its market value in different destinations. Getting the harvested resin from southern Arabia to consumers in Rome, Alexandria, Babylon, and beyond required one of the most extraordinary trade networks in ancient history. The incense roads stretched over 2,000 miles of desert, mountain, and coastal terrain. Caravans of hundreds of camels moved in organized trains, carrying tons of resin northward along established routes that had been refined over generations. These weren't casual journeys. They were logistically complex expeditions requiring precise knowledge of water sources, safe passages through tribal territories, seasonal timing to avoid extreme heat, and diplomatic arrangements with the various peoples who controlled segments of the route. The journey could take months, and every step exposed the cargo to risks from bandits, tribal conflicts, sandstorms, and the simple, brutal reality of desert travel. Control of this trade, whether at the source at critical way stations or at transshipment points where routes diverged, brought staggering wealth. The southern Arabian kingdoms that dominated frankincense production became legendary for their prosperity. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder complained that Arabia spent so much on luxury goods that it drained wealth from the empire, all because Romans couldn't stop buying incense for their temples and funerals. The trade generated tax revenues, funded military capabilities, and created political influence that allowed Arabian kingdoms to negotiate with major powers as peers rather than subjects. And this brings us back to Ubar and its fortifications. The thick walls at Shisr weren't protecting ordinary merchandise. They were protecting what might have been the most concentrated wealth per unit weight anywhere in the ancient world. Frankincense resin stored in bulk, awaiting caravan transport north, represented fortunes compressed into compact, easily stolen packages. The fortress existed because that cargo required protection at its most vulnerable point, where it accumulated before departure, where caravans assembled, where the logistics of long-distance transport converged. Every defensive feature, the walls, the controlled entry points, the internal organization, served the same fundamental purpose: securing the flow of resin from source to market. The wealth that built those walls came directly from the frankincense trade, either as fees charged to passing caravans, as profits from direct trade operations, or as payments from southern kingdoms maintaining strategic way stations on their supply lines. But then the trade collapsed. Not suddenly, not from a single catastrophe, but through a slow convergence of changing realities that eroded the frankincense economy over centuries. Roman demand declined as Christianity spread across the empire. The new religion didn't require the same elaborate incense rituals that pagan worship demanded. Overland routes became less viable as political instability disrupted the tribal arrangements that kept caravans safe. Maritime trade developed, ships carrying incense directly from Arabian ports to Roman markets, bypassing the desert routes entirely, The way stations that had depended on overland traffic found their revenue shrinking year by year. The entire network that had sustained settlements like Ubar began to fray. Without the trade, there was no economic reason to maintain an outpost in the empty quarter. The resource that had built the city became the resource that, when its markets transformed, left the city without purpose. But the physical collapse of the trade network and the geological fate of the city itself only tell part of the story. There's another layer to Ubar's disappearance, one that transcends shifting markets and sinkholes and dives straight into the realm of human belief. Because long before archaeologists started debating soil samples and fortification walls, the story of Ubar was being preserved in a completely different way. As a moral tale, a warning etched not in stone but in memory. The Quranic account of Iram of the Pillars doesn't just describe a city that fell. It describes a city that earned its fall. According to the narrative, the people of Iram were granted extraordinary wealth and power by their creator. They built massive structures, established vast trade networks, and lived in a level of prosperity that seemed almost supernatural. But instead of recognizing their fortune as something that demanded gratitude and responsibility, they succumbed to hubris. They became arrogant. They believed their wealth made them invincible, that their fortified walls and economic dominance could protect them from any consequence. They ignored the warnings of the prophet Hud, who told them that their pride had corrupted their purpose and that continued defiance would bring catastrophic retribution. The people mocked him. They clung tighter to their excess. And then, in a single devastating moment, the punishment arrived. Not through a prolonged siege or a gradual economic decline, but through an overwhelming, annihilating force that erased them from the earth, as if they had never existed. This is the classic architecture of a cautionary tale. The rise, the corruption, the warning, the dismissal, and the catastrophic fall. But what makes Ubar's story particularly fascinating is how this moral framework intersects with what we now understand about the actual physical destruction. The myth says divine punishment. The geology says sinkhole collapse. The archaeology says fractured limestone beneath an overstressed fortress. And maybe, just maybe, these aren't competing explanations. Maybe they're different languages describing the same phenomenon. Think about what a sinkhole collapse would have looked like to the people living in that region. One day, a legendary fortress stands at the crossroads of the world's most valuable trade route, seemingly permanent, seemingly untouchable. The next day, it's gone, swallowed into the earth. No slow decline visible on the horizon, no advancing enemy army to prepare against. Just sudden, total annihilation. If you're an ancient observer trying to make sense of that event, what conclusion do you reach? That the earth simply decided to open up one random morning, or that something beyond human comprehension had intervened, that the city's obvious pride and excess had finally triggered a response from forces greater than any walls could withstand. This pattern repeats across dozens of ancient cultures, Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed for their moral corruption. Babylon prophesied to fall for its imperial arrogance. The Greek myth of Helisi, a city swallowed by the sea after its citizens offended Poseidon. Pompeii, which early Christian commentators interpreted as divine judgment for decadence, though we now know a volcano was responsible. These narratives aren't isolated inventions. They form a coherent tradition of using catastrophic destruction as a vehicle for moral instruction. The physical event becomes a deity, a carrier, for a lesson about human limits. Oral tradition excels at this kind of transformation. When a real disaster obliterates a community, the survivors and their descendants face a profound explanatory challenge. Random catastrophe is terrifying because it suggests the universe is indifferent, that destruction can strike anyone at any time for no reason. That's a psychologically unbearable reality. So human memory reworks the event. It searches for cause and effect, for something the victims did that might have provoked their fate. This isn't dishonesty, it's a survival mechanism. If destruction comes because of identifiable behavior, then you can avoid that behavior. You can control your risk. The myth of divine punishment for hubris isn't just a story. It's a cognitive framework that makes catastrophic randomness survivable by making it morally legible. At Shisr, the intersection of archaeology and myth creates something rare, a place where we can see both the physical reality and the cultural interpretation layered on top of each other, still partially visible, still interacting. The Sinkhole explains how the city died. The moral tale explains why people needed to believe it died for a reason. And together they preserve a more complete truth than either could alone. The physical vulnerability of limestone foundations under a heavily watered, heavily built fortress. The cultural vulnerability of a community that forgot that prosperity built on a single fragile trade route is never as permanent as it feels. The geological fact that the earth can open up without warning. The psychological fact that humans will always seek meaning in that opening. This dual legacy is what makes Ubar genuinely significant beyond its status as an archaeological site. It's not just a place where an ancient trade outpost fell into a hole. It's a place where a real catastrophe was transformed into a moral narrative so compelling that it survived for over 1,000 years in oral tradition before being recorded in one of the world's most influential religious texts. The city disappeared, but the lesson about the limits of human pride outlived the walls that pride had built. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because not everyone buys the connection between that sinkhole at Shisr and the legendary city of Iram. And the skeptics aren't just internet contrarians or casual doubters. They're serious archaeologists, geographers and historians who have spent decades poking holes in the narrative that Clapp and his team constructed. And their arguments deserve a real look, not a dismissive wave of the hand. The first problem is scale. The Quran describes Iram of the Pillars as a city of immense grandeur, a place with massive architecture, towering columns, a metropolitan centre that dominated an entire region. But what was actually uncovered at Shisr? A fortress, a trading outpost, something roughly the size of a modest caravanserai, not a sprawling urban civilization. The physical footprint of the Shisr ruins is tiny compared to the mythic proportions of Iram. Skeptics argue that you can't just take a relatively small frontier fort and scale it up to match a legend about one of the great cities of the ancient world without some serious intellectual gymnastics. Then there's the continuity problem. For Shisr to be Ubar, you have to assume that the oral tradition preserved the memory of this specific location accurately for potentially thousands of years before it was recorded in written texts. But we know how oral transmission works. Stories morph, locations shift, names get attached to places that sound similar but have no actual historical connection. The Quranic Iram might preserve the genuine memory of a destroyed city, but that doesn't mean it preserves the memory of this particular destroyed city. The legend could be referring to a completely different site, or it could be a composite narrative that merged memories of multiple lost settlements into one mythic metropolis. Alternative candidate sites have been proposed, and some of them are compelling. Several researchers have pointed to locations deeper in the empty quarter, places that satellite imagery revealed but that ground teams have never properly investigated, because the logistics of reaching them are nearly impossible. These sites show larger surface signatures than Shisr, more consistent with what you'd expect from a genuinely major ancient settlement. Other scholars have argued that the real Iram might have been located in Yemen rather than Oman, based on geographical clues in classical texts and the distribution of frankincense-producing territories. The trade networks that made such cities wealthy extended across a vast region, and there were multiple nodes along those routes that could have grown powerful enough to generate the kind of legend that became Iram. And then we have to talk about the media problem, because the Shisr identification didn't emerge from a careful, peer-reviewed archaeological process. It emerged from a documentary film project. Nicholas Clapp was a filmmaker, not an archaeologist, and his investigation was shaped by the demands of storytelling from the very beginning. That's not inherently bad. It's what got the search started in the first place. But it does mean that the framing was always going to lean toward dramatic resolution, rather than cautious ambiguity. When the Discovery Channel and NASA get involved, when international news outlets are waiting for a payoff, the pressure to declare victory becomes immense. Suddenly, a modest fortress becomes a legendary city. A plausible trade outpost becomes the lost Iram. The media cycle needed a definitive answer, and certainty sells better than nuance. Professional archaeologists who have examined the Shisr evidence often express frustration with this dynamic. The site is genuinely interesting on its own terms. A Frankincense trading outpost that collapsed into a sinkhole sometime in the ancient past. That's a real archaeological discovery with real scholarly value. But the overselling of the Ubar connection distorted public understanding of what was actually found and created a narrative that the evidence doesn't cleanly support. There's also a deeper philosophical issue at stake here. Linking legend directly to archaeological remains is inherently problematic because legends aren't historical records. They're cultural artifacts, shaped by the needs and values of the communities that preserve them. When we find ruins that match some elements of a story, our instinct is to declare confirmation, but that instinct can mislead us. A destroyed city in southern Arabia proves that cities in southern Arabia sometimes got destroyed. It doesn't prove that this specific destruction is the one that generated a specific legend recorded centuries later in a religious text. The gap between event and narrative is vast, and countless transformations can occur within it. So where does this leave us? With an honest question, not a settled answer. The Shisr site is real. The collapse is real. The connection to ancient frankincense trade is real. But whether that site is the Ubar of legend, whether it's the Iram described in the Quran, whether it's the city that T.E. Lawrence called the Atlantis of the sands, those remain open questions. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. The arguments on both sides have merit. And that's okay. History isn't a courtroom where we need a definitive verdict. It's an ongoing conversation where new evidence can always shift the balance. The smartest position right now is probably the most frustrating one. Stay curious, but stay uncertain. The empty quarter is enormous, barely explored, and almost certainly holding secrets we haven't found yet. Future excavations, improved satellite technology, better ground-penetrating radar might reveal sites that change the entire calculus of this debate. The Shisr discovery opened a door, but it didn't close the case, and the scholars who question the Ubar identification aren't enemies of the story. They're participants in the process that keeps the story honest. But here's the thing about that open question, that uncertainty isn't a dead end. It's actually the starting point for something far more interesting, because the debate over whether Shisr is truly Ubar or Iram has done something remarkable. It has kicked the door wide open on Arabian prehistory, a field that was basically a blank slate for generations, and the ripple effects of that discovery are still reshaping how we understand the ancient world today. Before Nicholas Clapp and his team dragged their equipment into the empty quarter, before NASA pointed its satellites at the Rub al-Khali, the standard archaeological narrative of southern Arabia was pretty straightforward. The region was considered a backwater, a vast empty sandbox that occasional traders crossed, but nobody actually built anything meaningful in. The real civilizations, the ones worth studying, were up in Mesopotamia or along the Nile or in the Levant. Arabia was just the empty space between them. a geographic obstacle, not a cultural powerhouse. That assumption wasn't just lazy, it was actively wrong. And the work at Shisr proved it. The discovery of a functioning, prosperous frankincense trading outpost, complete with sophisticated architecture, imported goods, and evidence of long-distance commercial networks, demolished the idea that ancient Arabia was culturally barren. Because if a place like Shisr could exist, if people were building substantial structures and running international trade operations from the harshest desert on Earth, then what else was out there? What other settlements, what other entire civilizations were lurking beneath those sand dunes, completely invisible to conventional archaeology? That question changed everything over the past few decades. Archaeological work in Oman and the broader Arabian Peninsula has exploded. Not just at Shisr, but at dozens of sites in the surrounding region. Researchers have uncovered evidence of complex societies that flourished thousands of years before the Islamic era. Societies with their own distinct architectural traditions, their own artistic styles, their own economic systems. We now know that Arabia wasn't empty before the rise of Islam. It was thriving, in its own harsh, resource-constrained way, and the frankincense trade was the engine that drove that prosperity. Ongoing work at Shisr itself has also evolved considerably since those first dramatic excavations. The early digs were necessarily limited, constrained by time, resources, and the sheer difficulty of working in a remote desert environment. But subsequent seasons of fieldwork have revealed layers of occupation that go deeper and stretch further back than anyone initially suspected. The site wasn't just a single fortress that got swallowed by a sinkhole. It was a place that people returned to, rebuilt and reoccupied over long stretches of time, even after the initial collapse. That tells us something important about human persistence. Even when the literal ground beneath your feet opens up and swallows your home, you come back, you rebuild, you try again. The location was that valuable, the access to water and trade routes that critical, that people refused to abandon it even after a catastrophic geological failure. Nearby sites have added more pieces to the puzzle. Surveys in the Dhofar region have identified numerous smaller settlements, way stations and processing centres that formed a network supporting the frankincense trade. This wasn't just one isolated outpost struggling alone in the desert. It was an entire economic ecosystem, a string of interconnected facilities that harvested, processed, stored, and shipped one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. Understanding this network has fundamentally changed how archaeologists think about ancient trade. It wasn't just about moving goods from point A to point B. It was about the infrastructure required to make that movement possible, the labour, the organisation, the repeated investment in fixed facilities that only made sense if the trade was enormously profitable and reliably sustained over generations. And the Shisr site has taken on a second life entirely separate from its archaeological significance. It has become a tourist destination, a place where people can travel to see the ruins that might possibly be the legendary lost city of Ubar. Oman has embraced the connection, incorporating the site into its heritage tourism infrastructure, building roads and visitor facilities that make this once impossible to reach corner of the desert accessible to anyone willing to make the journey. And people do make the journey. They come from all over the world, drawn by the same impulse that sent T.E. Lawrence dreaming about the Atlantis of the sands, the same impulse that drove Nicholas Clapp to chase satellite images across the empty quarter. The desire to stand in a place where myth and reality might, just might, overlap. Where you can look at ruins and wonder if the stories you heard as a child were echoing something real. This tourism brings complications, of course. Visitor traffic can damage fragile archaeological sites. The commercialization of heritage can oversimplify complex histories into marketable narratives. The same pressure to declare Shisr definitely Ubar that distorted the early media coverage can seep into tourist materials and guidebook descriptions. But it also brings something genuinely valuable: public engagement. The site has made Arabian archaeology visible to millions of people who would never otherwise have heard of it. It has generated funding and attention that support further research. It has created a constituency of people who care about preserving these fragile remnants of the ancient world, and that constituency matters when development pressures or budget cuts threaten archaeological sites. But despite everything we've learned, despite the transformed understanding of Arabian prehistory, despite the ongoing excavations and the tourist trails and the scholarly papers, the deepest mysteries of Shisr and the empty quarter remain unsolved. And that's what makes this story so compelling. We haven't closed the case. We've barely opened it. The sinkhole at Shisr is huge, and only a fraction of its buried contents have been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar has detected structures beneath the sand that haven't been touched. Walls and chambers and artifacts still waiting in the darkness. What's down there? More evidence that confirms the Ubar connection? Or material that complicates it further, that shows the site was something entirely different from what anyone has proposed? We don't know, not yet. And beyond Shisr, the empty quarter remains almost completely unexplored by archaeologists. It's just too difficult. The logistics of mounting a proper excavation in that environment, getting equipment, supplies, and personnel across hundreds of miles of uninhabited desert, working in temperatures that can kill you, dealing with sandstorms that can strip paint off vehicles, are almost prohibitive. Satellite imagery has identified dozens of promising locations, surface signatures that suggest buried structures, but ground teams have reached only a handful of them. The vast majority have never been visited by any researcher. Never been mapped, never been sampled, never been dug. What's waiting out there in the deepest desert? Probably not a single legendary city of immense grandeur. The skeptics are likely right that Iram, if it existed as described, wasn't located at Shisr. But that doesn't mean the empty quarter is empty. It means we haven't looked hard enough yet. And every year, the technology gets better. Satellite resolution increases. Ground-penetrating radar becomes more sensitive. Data processing algorithms become more sophisticated at detecting subtle anomalies beneath sand dunes. The tools are improving, the desire to use them is growing. The only thing missing is the massive, sustained effort required to actually get boots on the ground at all those remote locations. That effort will come eventually, maybe soon, maybe not for decades. But when it does, we're going to discover that the ancient history of Arabia is far more complex, far more surprising, and far more human than we ever imagined. Because people don't just survive in harsh environments. They build things, they create trade networks, they develop cultures. They tell stories about their ancestors and their gods and their lost cities. And then they bury those stories along with everything else beneath the sand. The rediscovery of whatever lies beneath the empty quarter isn't just an archaeological project. It's a reflection of something fundamental about who we are as a species. We are the creatures who refuse to forget. We tell stories across generations, across millennia, preserving memories of places and events that seem impossible, that sound like fantasy, that any rational person would dismiss as pure fiction. And then sometimes, not always, but sometimes, we go looking for those impossible places. And we find them. Or we find something real, something unexpected, something that doesn't perfectly match the legend, but that proves the legend wasn't entirely empty. There was a signal in all that noise, a kernel of truth buried in the myth, waiting for someone willing to dig. That's the legacy of the Ubar search, not a definitive archaeological identification, not a closed case, but a demonstration that human curiosity, when it's combined with modern technology and stubborn determination, can reach into the most inaccessible corners of the planet and pull out fragments of forgotten history. The story isn't over, it's barely begun. the sand is still holding secrets, and we're still out there looking for them. So where does this leave us? We started with a story that sounded like pure fantasy. A city of immeasurable wealth, swallowed by the desert as divine punishment for its arrogance. Iram of the Pillars, a place so mythical that for centuries scholars debated whether it was even meant to be a real location, or just a moral allegory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of human pride. The Quran described it. Bedouin traders whispered about it. Ancient geographers mapped it with varying degrees of confidence. But nobody could find it. For over 1,000 years, Iram remained exactly what its name implied, a legend, an echo beneath the sand. Then the 20th century arrived, and everything changed. Explorers like Bertram Thomas and Wilfred Thesiger started bringing back reports of tracks in the empty quarter, ancient paths that seemed to lead towards something substantial hidden under the dunes. Nicholas Clapp, a filmmaker with an obsession and a willingness to chase it across continents, took those fragments and turned them into a quest. And when NASA pointed its satellites at the harshest desert on Earth, when that technology revealed ghostly traces of caravan routes converging on a single point near Shisr, the myth cracked open. The fantasy became a coordinate, the legend became a dig site. What the excavations found wasn't the glittering metropolis of bedtime stories. It was something far more interesting, a real place, with real walls, real artifacts, real people who lived and worked and traded there. A fortress that controlled the frankincense trade, that connected ancient Arabia to the wider world, that made its inhabitants wealthy on the back of resin harvested from scraggly trees growing in the desert hills. A place that collapsed literally into a sinkhole, swallowed not by divine wrath but by geology, by the same unstable limestone aquifer that had given it life in the first place. The legend and the reality didn't match perfectly, but they overlapped. The echo had a source, and that's why lost cities like Ubar captivate us so deeply. It's not just the treasure, or the romance of ruins, or the thrill of discovery. It's the possibility that human memory can reach across millennia, that stories passed down through countless generations can preserve traces of real events, real places, real people. It's the idea that our ancestors weren't just telling tales to entertain each other around the fire. They were encoding history, imperfectly, through the filters of culture and religion and time, but encoding it nonetheless. Every legend of a lost city, whether it's Atlantis, whether it's El Dorado, whether it's Iram of the Pillars, carries the same seductive promise. That somewhere beneath the exaggeration and the symbolism and the moralizing, there might be a kernel of truth. And that if we're clever enough, if we're persistent enough, if we're lucky enough, we might be able to dig that kernel out. The empty quarter hasn't given up all its secrets. Not even close. Ground-penetrating radar detects buried structures near Shisr that have never been excavated. Satellite imagery identifies anomaly signatures across the Rub al-Khali that suggest dozens of potential sites, places where the sand is hiding walls, artifacts, maybe even entire settlements that we currently know nothing about. The deepest desert remains almost completely untouched by archaeologists. The logistics are brutal, the costs enormous, the conditions literally life-threatening. But the mystery endures. What else is out there? What other cities? What other trade networks? What other chapters of human history are preserved beneath those endless dunes, waiting for someone willing to endure the harshest environment on Earth to uncover them? We don't know yet, and that uncertainty is what makes this story so compelling. We've traced the journey from Quranic legend to Bedouin whispers, to satellite imaging, to archaeological excavation. We've seen how modern technology can illuminate the ancient world in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. We've watched a myth become a reality, or at least become something real enough to stand on, to build further research upon, to reshape our understanding of Arabian prehistory. But the case isn't closed. The sand is still holding its secrets. The echoes are still reverberating beneath the surface, and the search for whatever else lies hidden in the empty quarter is far from over. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from all of you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching this from. I love seeing how this community spans the entire globe. People from every corner of the world coming together to explore these ancient mysteries. And if you've got thoughts on Ubar, on Iram, on whether Shisr is the real deal or just one piece of a much larger puzzle, share those too. The debate is still live, and your perspectives make these discussions richer. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the city buried beneath the desert that was old before Egypt was young, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And here's something a lot of you have been asking about. The single best way to support this channel and help us keep making content like this is to listen on Spotify. The link is in the description below. Streaming us there makes a real difference, and it lets you absorb all this history while you're on the move, commuting, working out, wherever your day takes you. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface. The past is always waiting to be found.